Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Tonight, we're traveling to Fargo, North Dakota to explore a case that shook a community and brought national attention to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is the story of Savannah LaFontaine Graywind, a young woman whose life was cut tragically short in the summer of... On a warm Saturday afternoon in August 2017, 22-year-old Savannah made a simple decision that would lead to an unthinkable tragedy. She agreed to help a neighbor with what seemed like an innocent request. What happened next would reveal the depths of human deception and the devastating consequences of a twisted plan. To understand this story, we need to first understand Savannah. She was 22 years old, 8 months pregnant, and living in a modest apartment building on the 200 block of 9th Street North in Fargo. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood that made headlines. It was working class, quiet, the sort of place where neighbors knew each other by name and children played in the courtyards. Savannah was a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and she carried with her the strength and resilience that had been passed down through generations of her family. She was excited about becoming a mother. Her pregnancy was progressing well, and she was just weeks away from holding her daughter in her arms. The apartment building where Savannah lived was a simple, multi-story structure. She shared her ground floor apartment with her mother, Norberta LaFontaine Graywind, and her younger brother. It was a close-knit family unit, the kind where everyone looked out for each other. Norberta was protective of her daughter, especially now that Savannah was so close to giving birth. Above them, on the 3rd floor, lived a couple that Savannah had come to know casually, Brooke Cruz and William Hohen. To the outside world, they seemed like an ordinary couple, but beneath the surface, something dark was brewing. Brooke, 38 years old, had been telling people she was pregnant. She had been spinning this lie for months, creating an elaborate fiction about her own impending motherhood. The building itself was unremarkable. Aging carpet in the hallways, thin walls that let you hear your neighbors' conversations. The kind of place where rent was affordable but amenities were few. It was home to working families, single parents, and young couples trying to make ends meet. No one who lived there expected it to become the center of a national news story. Saturday, August 19th, 2017, started like any other weekend day for Savannah. The summer heat was beginning to show its first signs of breaking, and the afternoon sun filtered through the windows of her apartment. She was comfortable, settling into the final weeks of her pregnancy, with the particular mixture of excitement and impatience that comes with expecting a first child. At 1:24 p.m., Savannah received a text message that would change everything. It was from Brooke Cruz, her upstairs neighbor. Brooke was asking if Savannah would come up to her apartment to help with something. She wanted Savannah to model a dress for her. It seemed innocent enough, the kind of neighborly request that happens every day in apartment buildings across the country. But what Savannah didn't know was that this wasn't a spontaneous request. Brooke had been planning this moment for some time. She had been watching Savannah, observing her routine, noting when she was alone and when her family members were around. This wasn't about a dress at all. It was about something much more sinister. Brooke had been living a lie for months. She had been telling her boyfriend, William Hohen, and others in her life that she was pregnant. She had created social media posts about her pregnancy, had talked about baby names, had even gone so far as to create a baby registry, but Brooke wasn't pregnant. She never had been. The psychology behind this deception is complex and disturbing. Brooke had apparently convinced herself that she needed a baby to maintain her relationship with William. She had watched Savannah throughout her pregnancy, seeing in her everything that she was pretending to be, and at some point, in her twisted thinking, she had decided that Savannah's baby would become her baby. Savannah, unaware of any of this, saw no reason to refuse her neighbor's request. She texted her mother to let her know where she was going, a simple message that would later become crucial evidence. Going upstairs to model a dress, she wrote. It was 1:24 in the afternoon, and Savannah was being helpful, as was her nature. She made her way up the stairs of the apartment building, her pregnant belly making the climb a bit more challenging than it might have been months earlier. She knocked on the door of apartment 3B where Brooke Cruz was waiting. When the door opened, Savannah stepped inside, expecting to spend a few minutes helping her neighbor and then returning to her own apartment. She had no way of knowing that she would never leave that apartment alive. What happened next inside Brooke Cruz's apartment represents one of the most calculated and horrific crimes imaginable. According to the evidence that would later come to light, Brooke had been planning this for some time. She had researched how to perform what's called a cesarean section using internet searches. She had gathered supplies. She had prepared for this moment. When Savannah entered the apartment, Brooke was ready. The exact sequence of events may never be fully known, but what investigators pieced together from evidence and Brooke's own eventual confession paints a picture of premeditated violence. Brooke attacked Savannah shortly after she entered the apartment. According to her later testimony, she struck Savannah in the head, causing her to lose consciousness. What followed was an act so unthinkable that it defies comprehension. Brooke cut Savannah's unborn baby from her womb while she was still alive. The medical examiner would later determine that Savannah died from blood loss and trauma. She was 8 months pregnant, just weeks away from her due date. Her baby, a daughter she had planned to name Heisley Joe, was born through this violent act and somehow survived. While this horror was unfolding, Savannah's mother, Norberta, was at home, expecting her daughter to return shortly. When 2:30 p.m. came and went without word from Savannah, Norberta began to worry. She sent her 16-year-old son upstairs to check on his sister. The boy knocked on the door of apartment 3B, but Brooke told him that Savannah had already left. This was the first lie in what would become a web of deception. Brooke was now in possession of a newborn baby, and she was prepared to claim it as her own. She had William Hone, her boyfriend, who may or may not have known the full extent of what had happened, but who was about to become complicit in the cover-up. At 4:30 p.m., when Savannah still hadn't returned home, Norberta went upstairs herself. She knocked on Brooke's door and was again told that her daughter had left. But a mother's instinct told her something was wrong. Savannah was 8 months pregnant, responsible and in constant contact with her family. She wouldn't just disappear. By this time, Brooke had already begun putting her plan into motion. She had wrapped Savannah's body in plastic and was preparing to dispose of it. She had cleaned up the apartment and was ready to present the newborn baby as her own child, the culmination of a pregnancy that had never existed. The transformation from neighbor to killer, from helper to victim, had taken place in the span of just a few hours on what had started as an ordinary Saturday afternoon. At 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, August 19th, Norberta LaFontaine Graywind made the phone call that would officially begin the search for her daughter. She called the Fargo Police Department to report Savannah missing. It had been only 3 hours since Savannah had texted about going upstairs, but Norberta knew in her heart that something was terribly wrong. The initial police response was measured, as is typical in missing person cases involving adults. Officers took the report, but there was no immediate sense of urgency. Adults have the right to come and go as they please, and it hadn't been very long since Savannah was last seen. But Norberta was persistent, and she knew her daughter better than anyone. As evening fell on Saturday, family and friends began their own search. They walked the streets around the apartment building, calling Savannah's name. They checked nearby businesses, asking if anyone had seen a pregnant young woman. They posted on social media, reaching out to their networks for any information. The Fargo Police Department's initial investigation was routine. They interviewed Norberta, took down the basic facts, and began the process of determining when and where Savannah was last seen. What they didn't know was that the person they needed to be looking at most closely was living just 2 floors above Savannah's apartment. Sunday, August 20th, brought no answers. The family's anxiety grew as the hours passed. They made flyers with Savannah's photo, describing her as 8 months pregnant, last seen wearing casual clothes. They distributed these throughout the neighborhood, hoping someone had seen something that might provide a clue. Meanwhile, Brooke Cruz and William Hone were maintaining their fiction. Brooke had a newborn baby that she was claiming was her own child, born prematurely. She had taken the baby to a hospital, saying she had given birth at home. The medical staff had questions. There was no record of Brooke's pregnancy, and the baby appeared to be full-term despite Brooke's claims of premature birth. This was where the plan began to show its weaknesses. Hospitals keep detailed records. Medical professionals are trained to spot inconsistencies. The baby was healthy and showed no signs of being premature. The staff began asking questions that Brooke couldn't answer satisfactorily. At the same time, Savannah's family was growing increasingly desperate. They organized larger search parties, reaching out to anyone who might help. Members of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians community rallied around the family, understanding that when indigenous women go missing, the response is often inadequate. The contrast between the two narratives playing out simultaneously is stark. On one hand, a family was desperately searching for their missing loved one, fearing the worst, but hoping for the best. On the other hand, the people responsible for her disappearance were going about their daily lives trying to maintain a lie that was already beginning to unravel. By Monday, August 21st, the police investigation began to take on more urgency. Savannah had been missing for more than 48 hours, and her family's concerns were legitimate. She was heavily pregnant, had no history of disappearing, and had last been seen going to help a neighbor. The pieces weren't adding up. As the investigation into Savannah's disappearance continued, the Fargo Police Department began to piece together a timeline of her last known movements. The text message she had sent to her mother at 1:24 p.m. on Saturday was crucial evidence. It established exactly where she was going and why. Detectives began interviewing residents of the apartment building more thoroughly. They spoke with Brooke Cruz and William Hohen, who maintained that Savannah had come to their apartment briefly and then left. Their story was consistent, but investigators were trained to look for inconsistencies, and they were beginning to find them. The hospital where Brooke had taken the newborn baby was also raising red flags. The medical staff had documented their concerns about Brooke's story. She claimed to have given birth at home, but there were no signs that she had recently given birth. The baby appeared to be full-term, not premature as Brooke claimed. Most importantly, there was no record of Brooke ever being pregnant. Hospital social workers were called in to investigate. This is standard procedure when there are questions about a baby's parentage or when the circumstances of a birth are unclear. The baby was healthy, but the questions surrounding her arrival at the hospital were mounting. Meanwhile, the search for Savannah continued. Volunteers combed through parks, vacant lots, and wooded areas around Fargo. The Red River, which runs through the city, was of particular concern. Water searches are always part of missing person investigations, but the river would soon prove to be more significant than anyone initially realized. On Wednesday, August 23rd, the family held a prayer event at Sanford Medical Center in downtown Fargo. They were asking for the public's help and calling on the police to do more. The event drew media attention, and Savannah's story began to spread beyond the immediate Fargo area. This was also when the investigation began to focus more intently on the apartment building where Savannah lives. Police started looking more closely at the movements of all residents on the day she disappeared. They began to notice that Brooke Cruz's story about her pregnancy didn't align with medical records or the observations of other residents. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to look more closely at the baby that Brooke claimed was hers. They arranged for DNA testing, which would definitively establish the baby's parentage. If Brooke was telling the truth, the DNA would match hers and William's. If she wasn't, the results would open up a much darker possibility. While waiting for the DNA results, police continued to investigate other aspects of the case. They looked at Brooke's internet search history and found disturbing evidence. She had been researching cesarean sections and childbirth procedures. She had been looking up information about how to perform surgical procedures without medical training. The combination of the hospital's concerns, the suspicious internet searches, and the lack of any evidence that Brooke had actually been pregnant was building a compelling case. But they still needed definitive proof, and they still needed to find Savannah. On Thursday, August 24th, 5 days after Savannah LaFontaine Graywind was last seen alive, kayakers on the Red River made a discovery that would confirm the family's worst fears. They found a body wrapped in plastic, floating in the water near the Cass County line. The body was recovered by the Cass County Sheriff's Office and the Fargo Police Department. While formal identification would take time, the circumstances left little doubt about who had been found. The LaFontaine Graywind family was notified, and their hopes for Savannah's safe return were finally devastatingly extinguished. The same day, DNA results came back confirming what investigators had begun to suspect. The baby that Brooke Cruz claimed was hers was actually Savannah's daughter. The biological evidence was undeniable. Brooke had not given birth to this child. The baby belonged to Savannah LaFontaine Greywind. With this confirmation, the investigation shifted from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. Brooke Cruz and William Hone were arrested. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and lying to police officers. The arrest of Brooke and William brought some answers, but also raised new questions. How had this been planned? What exactly had happened in that apartment on Saturday afternoon? And how had they thought they could get away with it? During initial questioning, both Brooke and William maintained their innocence, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. The DNA results, the suspicious internet searches, the inconsistencies in their stories, and the discovery of Savannah's body all pointed to their involvement in her death. The baby, meanwhile, was placed in the care of Child Protective Services while the legal issues surrounding her custody were resolved. She was healthy, having somehow survived the traumatic circumstances of her birth. The family wanted her to come home, but legal procedures had to be followed. The news of the arrests and the discovery of Savannah's body sent shockwaves through the community. The apartment building where this had all taken place became a crime scene, with investigators processing evidence and trying to piece together exactly what had happened. The medical examiner's preliminary findings confirmed that Savannah had died from blood loss and trauma consistent with the removal of a fetus. The full autopsy would provide more details, but the basic facts were already clear. Savannah had been murdered, and her baby had been cut from her womb. The case now moved from investigation to prosecution, but the healing process for Savannah's family was just beginning. The legal proceedings that followed Savannah's murder were complex and emotionally charged. Brooke Cruz and William Hone were charged separately, and their cases would follow different paths through the justice system. Brooke Cruz, faced with overwhelming evidence against her, eventually decided to plead guilty. In December 2017, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and kidnapping. Her plea agreement included a detailed confession of what had happened in her apartment on August 9th. According to Brooke's confession, she had lured Savannah to her apartment with the pretext of modeling a dress. Once Savannah was inside, Brooke attacked her, striking her in the head to render her unconscious. She then performed a crude cesarean section, removing the baby from Savannah's womb. Savannah died from the trauma and blood loss. The confession provided closure in terms of understanding what had happened, but it also revealed the premeditated nature of the crime. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was a carefully planned murder designed to steal an unborn child. In February 2018, Brooke Cruz was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted the particularly heinous nature of the crime, and the fact that it involved the murder of a pregnant woman. The sentence ensured that Brooke would never again be a threat to society. William Hone's case was more complicated. Prosecutors argued that he was part of the conspiracy, that he knew about the plan, and helped cover up the crime. Hone's defense team argued that he was unaware of what Brooke had done and that he had been deceived just like everyone else. The evidence against Hone was less clear-cut than the evidence against Brooke. While he had certainly lied to police and had helped dispose of evidence, proving that he was part of the original plan to murder Savannah was more challenging. Hone's trial took place in September 2018, nearly a year after the crime. The proceedings were closely watched by the community and by advocates for missing and murdered Indigenous women. The case had become a symbol of the violence that disproportionately affects Indigenous women in the United States. During the trial, Brooke Cruz testified against William Hone, describing the events of August 19th and Hone's role in the aftermath. Her testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, but it was also the testimony of someone who had admitted to murder, which complicated its credibility. The jury ultimately acquitted Hone of conspiracy to commit murder, the most serious charge against him. However, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and lying to police officers. The mixed verdict reflected the complexity of his involvement in the crime. Hone was initially sentenced to life in prison, but this sentence was later reduced to 20 years after successful appeals. The reduction was controversial, with many in the community feeling that it was inadequate given the severity of the crime. The murder of Savannah LaFontaine Greywind had impacts that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. Her death became a rallying point for advocates, working to address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States. Statistics show that Indigenous women face rates of violence that are significantly higher than the general population. They are more likely to be victims of murder, sexual assault, and domestic violence. Their cases often receive less media attention and fewer resources for investigation and prosecution. Savannah's case was different in that it did receive significant media coverage, but this only highlighted how many similar cases go unnoticed. Her death sparked conversations about the need for better protection for Indigenous women and more resources for investigating crimes against them. In 2018, Congress passed Savannah's Act, legislation named in her honor that requires the Department of Justice to coordinate with tribal governments and improve the response to missing and murdered Indigenous women cases. The law also requires better data collection and reporting on these crimes. Savannah's daughter, who survived the attack, was eventually placed with family members who could provide her with love and care. The baby's survival was seen as a miracle, a small light in the darkness of the tragedy. She would grow up knowing the story of her mother's love and sacrifice. The apartment building where the crime took place has returned to being a quiet residential complex, but the memory of what happened there remains. The community has found ways to honor Savannah's memory, including annual walks and memorial services. Her family continues to advocate for other missing and murdered Indigenous women. They have turned their grief into action, working to ensure that other families don't have to endure what they went through. Norberta LaFontaine Greywind has become a powerful voice for change, speaking at conferences and working with lawmakers. The case also highlighted the importance of community in times of crisis. The way that Savannah's family, friends, and community came together to search for her and support each other showed the strength of human connections in the face of unthinkable tragedy. As we conclude this story, we remember Savannah not just as a victim of a horrible crime, but as a young woman who was loved, who was excited about becoming a mother, and who deserved to live a full life with her daughter. Her legacy lives on in the legislation that bears her name, in the advocacy work of her family, and in the daughter who survived against all odds. The case of Savannah LaFontaine Greywind reminds us that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life had value, whose death left a hole in the world, and whose memory deserves to be honored. May she rest in peace, and may her story continue to inspire efforts to protect other Indigenous women from violence. Please, I'm putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey to Mobile, Alabama, to explore one of the most heartbreaking missing person cases that has captivated investigators and the community for over a decade. This is the story of Brittany Shante Robinson, a vibrant 14-year-old girl whose disappearance on a seemingly ordinary summer day in 2012 would unravel into a complex web of family dysfunction, mental illness, and unanswered questions that persist to this day. This case, while tragic, reminds us of the importance of family bonds, the fragility of trust, and the enduring hope that even in the darkest mysteries, truth eventually finds its way to light. Brittany Shante Robinson was born into a world that would challenge her in ways no child should ever face. At 14 years old in the summer of 2012, she was a typical teenager navigating the complexities of adolescence, while dealing with circumstances far beyond her control. Brittany lived with her mother, Tiana Hogue, in Mobile, Alabama, a port city known for its rich history and southern charm. Mobile sits along the Gulf Coast, where the warm, humid air carries the scent of magnolias and the distant sound of ships making their way through the bay. It's a city where families have deep roots, where everyone knows their neighbors, and where a missing child becomes everyone's concern. The relationship between Brittany and her father, Demetric Al Hooper, was complicated by his ongoing battle with schizophrenia. Mental illness can strain even the strongest family bonds, and in this case, it created an unpredictable dynamic that would prove to have devastating consequences. Despite these challenges, Brittany maintained a relationship with her father, visiting him periodically as many children of divorced parents do. Brittany was described by those who knew her as a bright-spirited young woman with dreams and aspirations, typical of any teenager. She attended school regularly, had friends, and like many 14-year-olds, was beginning to develop her own sense of identity and independence. Her mother, Tiana, worked hard to provide stability in their household, creating a safe haven where Brittany could be a normal teenager despite the complexities surrounding her father's condition. The summer of 2012 had started like any other for the Robinson family. June in Mobile brings the full force of southern summer weather, days that stretch long and hot, with afternoon thunderstorms that provide temporary relief from the humidity. Children spend their days swimming, playing outside until the streetlights come on, and savoring the freedom that summer vacation brings. For Brittany, this particular summer would be different. She had been looking forward to spending some time with her father, a visit that had been planned as a brief 2-day stay. These visits were always carefully arranged, taking into consideration Demetric's mental health status and his ability to provide appropriate care for his daughter during her time with him. June 14, 2012, began as an ordinary Thursday morning in Mobile. The sun rose over Mobile Bay, casting long shadows across the quiet residential streets where families were starting their day. In households throughout the city, parents were getting ready for work. Children were sleeping in during their summer vacation, and the rhythms of daily life continued as they had for countless mornings before. For Brittany Robinson, this morning held the excitement of seeing her father. She had been looking forward to this visit, a planned 2-day stay that would give her quality time with Demetric. Despite the challenges his mental illness presented, Brittany loved her father and cherished the moments when they could connect and spend time together. The arrangements for the visit had been carefully made. Brittany's aunt would be responsible for transportation, driving her to Demetric's home on McCovery Road in Mobile. This wasn't unusual. Family members often helped facilitate these visits, ensuring that Brittany could maintain her relationship with her father while also providing an extra layer of oversight and support. At 9 a.m., Brittany's aunt pulled up to the modest home on McCovery Road, where Demetric Cooper lived. The neighborhood was quiet, typical of residential areas where working families had already left for their daily routines. Trees lined the street, providing shade from what would soon become another scorching Alabama summer day. Brittany was excited as she gathered her things for the visit. She had packed clothes for 2 days, perhaps brought along some of her favorite books or music, and was looking forward to spending this time with her father. At 14, she was old enough to appreciate these visits, and young enough to still enjoy the simple pleasure of having her father's undivided attention. The aunt watched as Brittany walked up to the front door, her father greeting her with what appeared to be genuine happiness at seeing his daughter. There were no signs of distress, no indication that anything was amiss. This appeared to be just another routine visit, the kind that had happened many times before without incident. As the aunt drove away from McCovery Road that morning, she had no way of knowing that this would be the last time anyone would see Brittany Robinson alive. The image of her niece walking confidently toward her father's house, ready for what she expected to be enjoyable 2 days, would become frozen in time, as the final confirmed sighting of a young girl whose fate would become one of Mobile's most enduring mysteries. The morning continued peacefully in the neighborhood. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware that something tragic might be unfolding just houses away from their own. Children played in nearby yards, cars moved slowly down the residential streets, and life in this corner of Mobile continued its normal pace. But inside the house on McCovery Road, something went terribly wrong. What should have been a joyful reunion between father and daughter became the beginning of a mystery that would consume investigators, devastate a family, and leave a community searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. The house itself would later become a focal point of intense scrutiny. Investigators would search every room, every closet, every possible hiding place, looking for clues about what happened to Brittany in those first crucial hours after her arrival. But the house, like Demetric himself, would keep its secrets, offering no clear answers about the fate of the 14-year-old girl who had walked through its front door full of anticipation for time with her father. The first sign that something was wrong came not from a dramatic event, but from the absence of the ordinary. 2 days passed, and Brittany did not return home as planned. There was no phone call from her father explaining a delay, no message from Brittany herself asking to extend her visit. There was simply silence where there should have been communication. In many families, this might have been dismissed as poor communication, or a change of plans that hadn't been properly conveyed. But Tiana Hogue knew her daughter well. Brittany was responsible for her age, and she understood the importance of staying in touch with her mother. The silence was completely out of character. and it sent alarm bells ringing in a mother's intuitive heart. June 16th passed without word. June 17th brought no news. By June 18th, Tiana's concern had transformed into genuine fear. She tried calling Demetric's house repeatedly, but there was no answer. The phone would ring and ring, echoing in what she imagined to be an empty house, though she had no way of knowing if anyone was there or not. The decision to involve authorities wasn't made lightly. In some families, calling the police on a relative is seen as a betrayal, a crossing of lines that can never be uncrossed. But Tiana's maternal instincts overrode any concerns about family loyalty. Something was wrong, and she needed help finding her daughter. On June 22, 2012, 8 days after Brittany was last seen, Tiana Hogue filed a missing person report with the Mobile Police Department. The report officially marked the beginning of what would become one of the department's most challenging and longest-running investigations. Detective work in missing person cases often begins with the last known location and the last people to see the missing individual. In Brittany's case, both of these led directly to Demetric Hooper and his house on McCovery Road. This created an immediate complication for investigators. The primary person of interest was also the father of the missing child, someone who should have been their greatest ally in the search for answers. When investigators first attempted to interview Demetric about his daughter's disappearance, they encountered a man whose mental illness made standard interrogation techniques challenging. Schizophrenia can affect a person's ability to communicate clearly, their perception of reality, and their emotional responses to situations. Determining whether Demetric's behavior was the result of his mental condition, grief over his missing daughter, or potential guilt became an immediate challenge for the investigation team. The initial interviews revealed inconsistencies in Demetric's account of Brittany's visits. His timeline was unclear, his descriptions of their activities together were vague, and his emotional responses seemed disconnected from the gravity of the situation. However, these same symptoms could be explained by his diagnosed mental illness, making it difficult for investigators to determine what was significant and what was simply the manifestation of his psychological condition. As the days turned into weeks, the case began to attract attention beyond the immediate family. Missing person flyers with Brittany's photograph began appearing around Mobile. Her image, a beautiful young girl with bright eyes and a warm smile, became a familiar sight on telephone poles and store windows and on community bulletin boards throughout the city. The media began covering the story, bringing wider attention to Brittany's disappearance. Local news stations featured her case in their evening broadcasts, newspapers ran articles about the missing teenager, and social media began spreading information about the search for answers. With each passing day, the community's investment in finding Brittany grew stronger, even as the chances of finding her alive grew statistically smaller. The investigation took a dramatic turn when detectives made a discovery that would forever change the direction of their search. Demetric Hooper had left Mobile shortly after Brittany's disappearance, abandoning his home on McCovery Road and effectively disappearing himself. This development was significant for several reasons. First, it suggested consciousness of guilt. Innocent people typically don't flee when their loved ones go missing. Second, it made Demetric unavailable for follow-up questioning, at a crucial time when investigators needed to clarify the inconsistencies in his initial statements. Third, it demonstrated a level of planning and forethought that seemed inconsistent with someone experiencing a mental health crisis. The timing of Demetric's departure was particularly troubling. Rather than staying in Mobile to help search for his daughter, to answer questions from investigators, or to support the family during this crisis, he had chosen to leave town. This decision would have devastating consequences for the investigation and for his relationship with law enforcement. For 6 weeks, Demetric Hooper was a man without a fixed address. During this time, investigators had no way to continue their interviews with him, no opportunity to ask follow-up questions that might have clarified the timeline of Brittany's disappearance, and no chance to observe his behavior and demeanor as the investigation progressed. The warrant for Demetric's arrest was issued not for murder or kidnapping, but for interfering with a police investigation. This charge reflected the legal reality that while investigators strongly suspected Demetric's involvement in his daughter's disappearance, they didn't yet have enough evidence to support more serious charges. The interference charge provided them with the legal authority to bring him back for questioning and to prevent him from continuing to evade their investigation. While Demetric was missing, the investigation continued on multiple fronts. Detectives conducted extensive searches of his abandoned home on McCovery Road. looking for any evidence that might explain what had happened to Brittany. They interviewed neighbors, trying to establish whether anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the time Brittany was supposed to be visiting her father. The searches of the house were thorough and methodical. Investigators looked for signs of violence, evidence of a struggle, or any indication of what might have happened to Brittany during her visit. They examined the floors for bloodstains, checked walls for damage that might indicate a violent altercation, and searched for any personal belongings that Brittany might have left behind. These searches would prove frustrating for investigators. The house yielded no clear evidence of what had happened to Brittany. There were no obvious signs of violence, no clear indicators of where she might have gone, and no physical evidence that definitively proved she had been harmed. The absence of evidence, however, was not evidence of absence. It simply meant that whatever had happened to Brittany had either occurred elsewhere or had been carefully concealed. The discovery of Demetric's location came through an unexpected channel. Rather than being found through detective work or fugitive tracking, he was located at a mental health facility in Arkansas. This revelation added another layer of complexity to the case and raised questions about his mental state during the time Brittany was missing. The news that Demetric Hooper had been found at a mental health facility in Arkansas 6 weeks after his daughter's disappearance created a mixture of relief and frustration for investigators. On one hand, they finally knew where he was and could potentially resume their questioning. On the other hand, his location raised new questions about his mental states and his ability to provide reliable information about Brittany's fate. Mental health facilities serve as sanctuaries for individuals experiencing psychiatric crises, providing treatment, medication management, and a safe environment for people whose grip on reality may be tenuous. For someone with schizophrenia like Demetric, such a facility could represent a necessary retreat from overwhelming circumstances, whether those circumstances were related to guilt, grief, or the progression of his mental illness. The fact that Demetric had sought treatment voluntarily suggested that he recognized his need for help. This could be interpreted in several ways. Perhaps the stress of his daughter's disappearance had exacerbated his mental illness, driving him to seek professional assistance. Alternatively, if he was responsible for Brittany's disappearance, the psychological burden of his actions might have pushed him toward a mental health crisis requiring immediate intervention. For investigators, Demetric's hospitalization presented both opportunities and challenges. The opportunity lay in the possibility that proper medication and therapeutic intervention might help him provide clearer, more consistent information about the events surrounding Brittany's disappearance. The challenge was that anything he said while in treatment might be influenced by his mental illness, medication effects, or the therapeutic environment itself. The legal implications of Demetric's mental health status were also significant. In criminal proceedings, a defendant's mental competency is crucial to determining their ability to understand charges against them and assist in their own defense. If Demetric's mental illness was severe enough to impair his understanding of reality, it could complicate any future prosecution related to Brittany's case. During this period, the investigation continued without Demetric's direct involvement. Detectives expanded their search efforts, conducted additional interviews with family members and acquaintances, and explored alternative theories about what might have happened to Brittany. They looked into her social media accounts, interviewed her friends, and investigated whether there might have been someone else in her life who could have been involved in her disappearance. The community support for finding Brittany remained strong during these weeks. Volunteer search parties combed through wooded areas around Mobile, checking abandoned buildings, searching near waterways, and following up on tips from citizens who thought they might have seen something relevant to the case. These grassroots efforts demonstrated the deep impact Brittany's disappearance had on the community and the determination of ordinary citizens to help find answers. Social media played an increasingly important role in keeping Brittany's case in the public eye. Facebook pages dedicated to finding her attracted thousands of followers who shared her photograph, discussed theories about her disappearance, and provided emotional support to her family. These online communities became virtual gathering places for people invested in seeing justice for Brittany and closure for her family. The passage of time during Demetric's absence also had practical implications for the investigation. Memories fade, physical evidence can deteriorate or be lost, and witnesses may become less available or less reliable. Each day that passed without answers made the case more challenging to solve and reduced the likelihood of finding Brittany alive. As 2012 turned into 2013 and then into 2014, Brittany Robinson's case began the unfortunate transition from active investigation to cold case status. This doesn't mean that investigators stopped caring or stopped working on the case, but rather that the immediate leads had been exhausted and the case no longer received daily attention from detectives. Cold cases are a heartbreaking reality in law enforcement. They represent families left without answers, communities left without closure, and investigators left with a frustrating knowledge that somewhere, somehow, there are answers that remain just out of reach. For Brittany's family, each passing year brought the dual burden of grief and uncertainty, never knowing whether to mourn her as deceased or continue hoping for her return. Tiana Hogue faced the unimaginable challenge of living in limbo. How does a mother cope with not knowing whether her child is alive or dead? How does she navigate birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days when every moment is shadowed by questions about her daughter's fates? The psychological toll of having a missing child is immense, often described as a form of ambiguous loss that prevents the normal grieving process. During these years, advances in technology and investigative techniques offered new possibilities for cold cases. DNA analysis became more sophisticated, database searches became more comprehensive, and social media provided new ways to keep cases in the public eye. However, these advances could only help if there was physical evidence to analyze or new information to pursue. The lack of Brittany's body presented unique challenges for the investigation. Without physical remains, it was impossible to determine definitively what had happened to her, when it had happened, or where it had occurred. This absence of evidence made it extremely difficult to build a case against any potential suspect, regardless of how strong investigators' suspicions might be. Demetric Hooper's life, during these years, remained largely out of the public eye. His mental health status, his living situation, and his own thoughts about his daughter's disappearance were private matters that investigators could only speculate about. The passage of time might have provided him with opportunities to reflect on the events of June 2212. But it also gave him time to construct new narratives or further distance himself from whatever had actually occurred. The case periodically received renewed attention through media coverage, particularly around the anniversary of Brittany's disappearance. These annual remembrances served multiple purposes. They kept the case in the public consciousness, they provided opportunities for new witnesses to come forward, and they reminded investigators that this case remained unsolved and deserving of continued attention. Age progression photographs became an important tool in keeping Brittany's case alive. These computer-generated images showed what she might look like as she grew older, transforming from the 14-year-old girl who had disappeared into young woman she would have become. These images were distributed widely, appearing on missing person websites, social media platforms, and in law enforcement databases. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children became involved in Brittany's case, bringing national attention and resources to the search for answers. Their involvement meant that Brittany's case was included in national databases, shared with law enforcement agencies across the country, and featured in their ongoing efforts to locate missing children. As the years passed, statistical reality became increasingly difficult for Brittany's family to ignore. The longer a person remains missing, particularly a child, the less likely they are to be found alive. While families never want to give up hope, they also must find ways to cope with the probability that their loved one may never return home. By 2022, Brittany Robinson had been missing for 10 years. She would have been 24 years old, potentially finished with college, maybe starting a career, perhaps in a relationship, or even starting a family of her own. Instead, she remained frozen in time as the 14-year-old girl who had walked into her father's house on McCovery Road and never walked out. The 10th anniversary of Brittany's disappearance brought renewed media attention to the case. Local news stations ran retrospective pieces about the investigation, interviews with family members, and updates on any new developments. These anniversary stories served as important reminders that despite the passage of time, Brittany's case remained unsolved and her family continued to seek answers. During this decade, investigative techniques had evolved significantly. Cold case units became more common in police departments. Specialized teams were developed to handle long unsolved cases, and new technologies offered fresh approaches to old evidence. Advanced DNA testing, improved database searches, and sophisticated analytical techniques provided tools that hadn't been available when Brittany first disappeared. The role of social media in keeping cold cases alive also expanded dramatically during these years. Facebook groups, Twitter campaigns, and dedicated websites kept Brittany's story circulating online, reaching new audiences who might have information relevant to the case. These platforms also provided spaces for armchair detectives and true crime enthusiasts to discuss theories, share information, and maintain pressure for continued investigation. For investigators, the passage of time brought both challenges and opportunities. Witnesses' memories faded, physical evidence deteriorated, and some individuals who might have had relevant information passed away. However, time also sometimes loosened tongues. People who had been afraid to speak initially might become more willing to share information years later. And changing relationships might make former allies willing to reveal previously protected secrets. The evolution of Demetric Hooper's legal situation during these years also played a role in the ongoing investigation. His mental health status, any additional legal troubles he might have encountered, and his living situation all remained factors that investigators had to consider when evaluating the case and planning their approach to seeking new information. Brittany's mother, Tiana, faced the ongoing challenge of keeping her daughter's memory alive while also trying to build some semblance of a normal life for herself. The anniversaries were particularly difficult, bringing renewed attention to the case but also reopening emotional wounds that never fully healed. The support of family, friends, and the community became crucial in helping her navigate these difficult milestones. The case also became part of Mobile's collective memory, one of those stories that longtime residents remember and discuss when conversation turns to local mysteries. Brittany's photograph became a familiar image in the community, a reminder of a young life cut short and a family's ongoing search for answers. True crime podcasts and television shows occasionally featured Brittany's case, bringing it to national audiences and potentially reaching people who might have relevant information. These media presentations served the dual purpose of keeping the case alive in the public consciousness and providing new avenues for tips and information to reach investigators. As the 10-year mark passed, the question of whether Brittany's case would ever be solved became more pressing. Cold cases can remain dormant for decades before new information emerges, but they can also remain forever unsolved, becoming part of a community's collection of enduring mysteries. In 2023, more than 11 years after Brittany Robinson's disappearance, the case took an unexpected turn. Demetric Hooper, who had been living quietly in Oklahoma, found himself in legal trouble on unrelated charges. He was arrested on charges of assault with a dangerous weapon and burglary, accusations that had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance, but would prove to be the catalyst for renewed attention to Brittany's case. The arrest in Oklahoma meant that Demetric was once again in custody and potentially available for questioning about his daughter's fate. For investigators in Mobile who had been waiting more than a decade for another opportunity to interview him, this development represented an unexpected chance to pursue new leads in a case that had gone cold. While Demetric sat in an Oklahoma jail awaiting trial on the assault and burglary charges, investigators in Mobile were working with prosecutors to determine whether they finally had enough evidence to pursue murder charges in Brittany's case. This decision would not be made lightly. Prosecuting a murder case without a body is always challenging, and the passage of time had not made their case any stronger. The Cold Case Squad at the Mobile Police Department, working in conjunction with the District Attorney's Office, conducted a thorough review of all the evidence gathered over the previous 11 years. They re-examined witness statements, reviewed forensic evidence, and considered whether new investigative techniques might provide fresh insights into what had happened to Brittany. Mobile County District Attorney Keith Blackwood became a key figure in the decision to move forward with murder charges. His office had to weigh the strength of the evidence against the challenges of prosecuting a case that was more than a decade old and lacked the most crucial piece of evidence: Brittany's body. In February 2024, a Mobile County grand jury made a decision that would send shockwaves through the community and provide a measure of satisfaction to Brittany's family. They indicted Demetric Hooper for murder in connection with his daughter's disappearance. This indictment represented a significant development in a case that many had begun to believe would never see justice. The decision to pursue murder charges was based on what prosecutors described as the cumulative weight of evidence and the passage of time itself. District Attorney Blackwood stated that the length of time Brittany had been missing made it increasingly certain that she was no longer alive, and that the evidence pointed to her father as the person responsible for her death. The indictment meant that Demetric would face extradition from Oklahoma back to Mobile to stand trial for his daughter's murder. This legal process would bring him back to the city where Brittany had disappeared, where her family still lived, and where a community had been waiting more than a decade for answers about what had happened to the bright, promising young woman whose life had been cut tragically short. For Brittany's family, the indictment represented a bittersweet victory. While they were gratified that charges had finally been filed, the indictment also meant accepting the legal reality that Brittany was presumed dead, after more than 11 years of hoping against hope that she might somehow still be alive. They now had to confront the likelihood that she had died shortly after her disappearance. And the community response to the indictment was largely supportive, with many residents expressing satisfaction that the case was finally moving forward in the legal system. However, there was also recognition that an indictment is not a conviction, and that the prosecution would face significant challenges in proving their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The legal proceedings that followed Demetric Hooper's indictment unfolded with the careful deliberation that characterizes the American justice system. After being extradited from Oklahoma back to Mobile in May 2024, Demetric found himself facing the most serious charge possible in connection with his daughter's disappearance. The case presented unique challenges for both the prosecution and the defense. For prosecutors, the absence of Brittany's body meant they had to build their case on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and the cumulative weight of suspicious circumstances surrounding her disappearance. For the defense, Demetric's mental illness provided both an explanation for his behavior and a potential complicating factor in his ability to assist in his own defense. The trial, when it finally took place, captivated the Mobile community. After more than 12 years of speculation, theories, and unanswered questions, residents finally had the opportunity to hear the evidence presented in a formal legal setting. The courtroom was filled with community members, media representatives, and family members who had waited more than a decade for this moment. However, the American justice system requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and despite the strong suspicions that had surrounded Demetric Hooper for more than a decade, the jury ultimately found him not guilty of murder in connection with Brittany's disappearance. This verdict, delivered in June 2025, meant that Demetric would walk free from the charges related to his daughter's case. The not guilty verdict was devastating for Brittany's family and supporters who had hoped that the trial would finally provide answers and justice. However, it also demonstrated the high standard of proof required in criminal cases and the challenges inherent in prosecuting cases without physical evidence of the crime. For the community, the verdict raised complex questions about justice, evidence, and the nature of truth. Many people remained convinced of Demetric's guilt despite the jury's decision, while others accepted the verdict as evidence that the case against him had not been as strong as many had believed. The case remains officially unsolved, and Brittany Robinson is still considered a missing person rather than a confirmed homicide victim. Her disappearance continues to haunt the Mobile community and serves as a reminder of the many missing person cases that never receive the resolution that families desperately seek. As we conclude this story, Brittany would now be 27 years old. Somewhere, her story continues, either in whatever fate befell her in June 2012, or in the memories of those who knew and loved her. Her case serves as a reminder of the fragility of life, the complexity of family relationships, and the enduring impact that one person's disappearance can have on an entire community. The search for truth in Brittany's case may never end, but her memory lives on in the hearts of those who refuse to forget her, and in the ongoing efforts of investigators who continue to hope that someday, somehow, the answers will finally emerge. Please, if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to the suburbs of Colorado, where the digital age collided with ancient darkness in one of the most disturbing cases of recent memory. This is a story that challenges our understanding of human desperation, the dangers lurking in online spaces, and the tragic consequences when mental health struggles meet predatory behavior. The case of Natalie Bollinger is unlike many others we explore. It's a story that begins not with a traditional crime scene, but with a Craigslist advertisement. A digital cry for help that would ultimately lead to tragedy. It's a case that raises uncomfortable questions about suicide, murder, and the blurred lines between victim and perpetrator in our modern connected world. On December 28, 2017, 19-year-old Natalie Bollinger disappeared from Broomfield, Colorado. What followed was an investigation that would uncover a web of online communications, drug use, mental health struggles, and ultimately a cold-blooded killing that shocked investigators and left a family shattered. This isn't just a story about a single crime. It's a window into the dangers that young people face in the digital age, the complexity of mental health issues, and the predators who exploit vulnerability for their own dark purposes. It's also a story about a young woman whose life was cut tragically short, and the family who loved her and continues to seek answers about what really happened in her final days. Natalie's story forces us to confront difficult questions about responsibility, exploitation, and the thin line between helping someone in crisis and taking advantage of their desperation. As we explore this case, we'll see how the end of the internet can become a hunting ground for those who prey on the vulnerable, and how a young woman's cry for help became the instrument of her own destruction. To understand the tragedy that befell Natalie Bollinger, we must first understand who she was as a person, her dreams, her struggles, and the circumstances that led to her fateful encounter with Joseph Lopez in December. Natalie was born in Westminster, Colorado in 1998, into a family that would experience its share of upheaval and change. Her life was marked by frequent moves, taking her from Colorado to Rhode Island, and then to Virginia, where she spent part of her teenage years. This constant relocation, while not uncommon in many American families, meant that Natalie had to repeatedly adapt to new environments, make new friends, and establish herself in new communities. By all accounts, Natalie was an intelligent and ambitious young woman. Despite the challenges of frequent moves and family instability, she had managed to excel academically and had earned a scholarship to pursue her dream of becoming a registered nurse. This achievement spoke to her determination and her desire to help others, qualities that made her tragic end all the more heartbreaking. At 19, Natalie had returned to Colorado, living in Broomfield, a suburb northwest of Denver, known for its family-friendly atmosphere and strong sense of community. She was attending Churchland High School as she worked to complete her education, having fallen behind due to the various moves and transitions in her life. But rather than seeing this as a setback, Natalie viewed it as an opportunity to get back on track and pursue her goals. However, beneath the surface of her academic achievements and future plans, Natalie was struggling with issues that many young adults face, but which were particularly acute in her case. She had been battling depression and had experienced suicidal thoughts, a struggle that she had been dealing with for some time. This wasn't uncommon. Mental health issues affect millions of teenagers and young adults, and the transition to adulthood can be particularly challenging for those dealing with depression and anxiety. Compounding her mental health struggles was Natalie's relationship with drugs, particularly heroin. Drug addiction is a disease that affects people from all walks of life, all socioeconomic backgrounds, and all levels of intelligence and ambition. For Natalie, drugs may have initially seemed like a way to cope with her depression and the various stresses in her life, but they quickly became another source of pain and complication. The combination of mental health issues and drug addiction created a perfect storm in Natalie's life. She was dealing with the normal pressures of being a teenager, school, relationships, family dynamics, and planning for the future, while also battling depression and the physical and psychological demands of addiction. This combination often leaves young people feeling hopeless, isolated, and desperate for relief from their pain. Natalie's family was aware of her struggles to some degree, but like many families dealing with mental health and addiction issues, they may not have fully understood the depth of her despair. Mental illness often hides behind smiles and achievements, and even those closest to someone can miss the signs of how serious their internal struggle has become. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Natalie's mental state appears to have deteriorated significantly. The holidays can be particularly difficult for people struggling with depression, as the contrast between expected joy and internal pain can feel overwhelming. The pressure to appear happy and grateful during family gatherings can be exhausting for someone who is fighting just to get through each day. It was during this period of intense emotional pain that Natalie would make a decision that would change everything. Whether driven by genuine suicidal ideation, a cry for help, or some combination of both, she would turn to the internet, specifically to Craigslist, in a way that would ultimately seal her fate. The internet, which had promised to connect us all and provide resources and support for those in need, would instead become the medium through which Natalie would encounter the person who would end her life. Her story serves as a stark reminder of how the anonymity and accessibility of online platforms can be exploited by those with malicious intents, and how vulnerable people seeking help can instead find predators waiting to take advantage of their desperation. In late December 2017, as Natalie Bollinger struggled with her depression and addiction, she made a decision that would have fatal consequences. She posted an advertisement on Craigslist with the shocking title, "I want to put a hit on myself." This advertisement represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Natalie's case. Whether it was a genuine request for assistance with suicide, a cry for help, or perhaps both, it opened the door to a world of predators who would see her vulnerability as an opportunity rather than a reason for compassion. Craigslist, launched in 1995, had by 2017 become one of the most popular classified advertising websites in the world. People used it to sell items, find housing, seek employment, and connect with others for various purposes. But the site's minimal moderation and emphasis on anonymity had also made it a haven for illegal activities, including prostitution, drug dealing, and worse. The personals section of Craigslist had become particularly notorious for facilitating encounters that ranged from the merely inappropriate to the criminal. While many people used these sections legitimately to find relationships or companionship, others used them to prey on vulnerable individuals, engage in illegal activities, or worse. Natalie's advertisement was posted in this environment, a digital Wild West, where anonymity ruled and predators lurked behind fake personas and promises. Her post, with its explicit title about wanting to put a hit on herself, would attract responses from various types of people. Some genuinely concerned individuals who might try to talk her out of her plan. Others who were simply curious or disturbed by the request. And unfortunately, predators who saw an opportunity to exploit a vulnerable young woman. The exact content of Natalie's advertisement beyond the title is not fully known, but the title itself was clear enough to attract the attention of Joseph Michael Lopez, a 22-year-old man who would claim that he responded to her ad and agreed to help her die. Whether Lopez was motivated by money, some twisted sense of helping someone in pain, or darker impulses entirely, his response to Natalie's advertisement would set in motion the events that would lead to her death. The fact that Natalie turned to Craigslist rather than seeking help from mental health professionals, friends or family, speaks to the isolation and desperation she must have been feeling. For someone in the depths of depression and addiction, reaching out for traditional help can feel impossible. The stigma surrounding mental illness and addiction, combined with feelings of shame and hopelessness, can make it seem easier to seek anonymous help online rather than face the judgment of people who know you. This is one of the most tragic aspects of Natalie's story. Her advertisement on Craigslist may have been in part a cry for help, a way of expressing her pain and desperation to the world in hopes that someone would care enough to help her find a different path. Instead, it attracted someone who would exploit her vulnerability for his own purposes. The anonymity that made Craigslist appealing to Natalie also made it the perfect hunting ground for predators like Lopez. He could respond to her advertisement without revealing his true identity or intentions, could build a relationship with her through text messages and phone calls without her knowing who he really was, and could arrange to meet her in person while maintaining the fiction that he was simply responding to her request. The digital age has created new opportunities for both connection and exploitation. While the internet has enabled many people to find help, support, and community they might not otherwise have access to, it has also created new ways for predators to find and exploit vulnerable individuals. Natalie's case represents the dark side of this digital connectivity, the way that anonymity and distance can enable people to do things they might never do in face-to-face interactions. As we'll see, the relationship that developed between Natalie and Lopez through their online communications was built on deception from the beginning, with Lopez presenting himself as someone willing to help her end her pain while potentially having much darker motivations for agreeing to meet her. Joseph Michael Lopez was 22 years old in December 2017, just 3 years older than Natalie Bollinger, but the similarities between them ended there. While Natalie was struggling with mental health issues and addiction, fighting to complete her education and build a future for herself, Lopez was living a very different kind of life, one that would ultimately intersect with Natalie's in the most tragic way possible. Lopez lived in the Denver area, not far from where Natalie was staying in Broomfield. He was familiar with the online world of Craigslist and its various sections, including the personals ads, where people sought everything from casual encounters to more serious relationships. But Lopez's interest in these ads appears to have been more predatory than social. When he encountered Natalie's advertisement titled, "I want to put a hit on myself," Lopez saw an opportunity. Rather than responding with concern, offering resources for mental health help, or simply ignoring an obviously troubling post, He chose to engage with a vulnerable young woman who was clearly in crisis. This decision reveals something fundamental about Lopez's character and mindset. He was someone who was willing to exploit rather than help someone in desperate need. Lopez would later claim that he genuinely believed he was helping Natalie by agreeing to kill her, suggesting that he saw himself as providing a service she had requested. But this rationalization ignores several crucial facts. First, that assisted suicide is illegal in Colorado. Second, that someone in the depths of depression and addiction may not be capable of making rational decisions about ending their life. And third, that there were many other ways he could have responded to her advertisement that might have actually helped her. The fact that Lopez owned a gun, a Glock 9mm pistol, made him particularly dangerous. Gun ownership is legal and common in Colorado, but in the hands of someone willing to kill a vulnerable young woman, it became the instrument of tragedy. Lopez's possession of this weapon meant that when he agreed to meet Natalie, he came prepared to follow through on whatever plan they discussed. As Lopez and Natalie began communicating through text messages, a relationship developed that was fundamentally unequal and exploitative. Lopez held all the power in their interactions. He was older, more stable, armed, and apparently mentally healthy, while Natalie was struggling with addiction, depression, and suicidal thoughts. Rather than using his position of relative strength to help her find resources or talk her out of her desperate plan, Lopez encouraged and facilitated it. The text messages between Lopez and Natalie, more than 100 of them exchanged on the night she died, would later become crucial evidence in the case against him. These messages likely revealed the progression of their relationship from initial contact through the planning of their meeting, and possibly their discussion of how her death would be carried out. What makes Lopez's actions particularly disturbing is that he had multiple opportunities to change course. Every text message exchange was a chance to express concern for Natalie's welfare, to suggest she seek professional help, or to simply stop communicating with her. Instead, he continued to engage with her plans, and ultimately agreed to meet her in person. The question of Lopez's motivation remains one of the most troubling aspects of this case. Did he genuinely believe he was helping someone who wanted to die? Was he motivated by money? Did he see this as an opportunity to kill someone without consequences, believing that Natalie's own advertisement would provide him with legal cover? Or were there darker, more twisted motivations that drove him to respond to a suicidal teenager's cry for help with violence? Whatever his motivation, Lopez's actions represent a fundamental failure of human decency and compassion. When confronted with someone in crisis, he chose exploitation over empathy, violence over help. His decision to arm himself and meet with a vulnerable teenager would ultimately destroy 2 lives. Natalie's through her death and his own through the consequences of his choices. The fact that Lopez was willing to kill someone he had only communicated with online speaks to the dehumanizing effect of digital interactions. It's easier to harm someone when you haven't looked them in the eye, when you don't know their family, when you've never seen them laugh or cry. The distance created by online communication may have made it easier for Lopez to see Natalie not as a human being in need of help, but as an opportunity or a problem to be solved through violence. On the evening of December 28, 2017, Natalie Bollinger and Joseph Lopez arranged to meet in person. This meeting, planned through their extensive text message exchanges, would be the culmination of their online relationship and would end with Natalie's death along a remote stretch of Riverdale Road in rural Adams County, Colorado. The location chosen for their meeting was telling. Riverdale Road runs through a sparsely populated area of Adams County away from the suburban neighborhoods where both Natalie and Lopez lived. This remote location provided privacy for whatever they had planned, but it also meant that there would be no witnesses to what actually transpired between them, no chance for intervention by concerned bystanders, and no immediate help available if Natalie changed her mind about her plans. The choice of such an isolated location raises questions about the true nature of what Lopez and Natalie had discussed. If this was genuinely an assisted suicide requested by Natalie, why choose such a remote location? If Lopez truly believed he was helping someone end their suffering, why the need for such secrecy and isolation? The location suggests that Lopez was well aware that what he was planning to do was illegal, and that he wanted to minimize the chances of being caught or interrupted. What exactly happened during their meeting may never be fully known, as Lopez's account is the only version of events we have. and his credibility is obviously questionable given his actions. According to Lopez's later statements to police, Natalie had requested that he kill her, and he had agreed to do so. He claimed that she had given him money for the service, and that he had shot her in the head with his Glock 9mm pistol as she had requested. But even Lopez's own account raises troubling questions. If Natalie truly wanted to die and had arranged for Lopez to kill her, why didn't she simply take her own life? Why involve another person in what could have been accomplished alone? And why choose a stranger from the internet rather than seeking help from family, friends, or mental health professionals? The autopsy results added another disturbing element to the case. While Natalie had indeed died from a gunshot wound to the head, toxicology tests revealed that she had a potentially lethal amount of heroin in her system at the time of her death. This finding complicates the narrative significantly and raises questions about what really happened during those final hours. Did Natalie take a lethal dose of heroin and then ask Lopez to shoot her as well? Was the heroin administered by Lopez to incapacitate her before the shooting? Did she overdose accidentally and Lopez then shot her for reasons of his own? Or was the heroin part of some plan to make her death appear to be a drug overdose rather than a homicide? The presence of such a high level of heroin in Natalie's system suggests that she may not have been fully conscious or capable of rational decision-making when she was shot. This raises serious questions about consent and whether she was truly able to request her own death, or whether Lopez took advantage of her incapacitated state to commit murder. The fact that Lopez fled the scene after shooting Natalie rather than staying to explain to authorities that he had been fulfilling her request for assisted suicide suggests consciousness of guilt. If he truly believed he had done nothing wrong, if he genuinely thought he was helping someone who wanted to die, why run? Why not immediately contact police and explain what had happened? Instead, Lopez left Natalie's body in the remote location and returned to his life, saying nothing about what had happened. He would later report his gun as stolen, a move that appears to have been an attempt to distance himself from the weapon used in Natalie's death. This behavior is inconsistent with someone who believed they had acted legally and morally in helping someone end their suffering. The remote location, the secrecy, the flight from the scene, and the attempt to cover up his involvement all point to Lopez knowing that what he had done was wrong, illegal, and indefensible. His actions suggest not a compassionate response to someone's request for help in dying, but a cold-blooded murder disguised as assisted suicide. When Natalie's body was discovered the next day, December 29, 2017, it began an investigation that would ultimately reveal the truth about what had happened along that lonely stretch of road. The evidence would paint a picture not of a tragic assisted suicide, but of a vulnerable young woman who had been exploited and killed by someone who saw her desperation as an opportunity rather than a cry for help. When Natalie Bollinger's body was discovered along Riverdale Road on December 29, 2017, it launched an investigation that would challenge investigators to unravel a complex web of online communications, mental health issues, and ultimately cold-blooded murder disguised as something else entirely. The initial discovery of Natalie's body presented investigators with more questions than answers. A young woman had been shot to death in a remote location, but the circumstances didn't fit the typical patterns of robbery, sexual assault, or domestic violence that investigators commonly encounter. There was no evidence of a struggle, no signs of theft, and no obvious connection between the victim and the location where she was found. The first crucial breakthrough came when investigators began examining Natalie's cell phone. In modern homicide investigations, digital evidence has become increasingly important, and cell phones often contain the key to understanding a victim's final days and hours. Natalie's phone would prove to be no exception. The phone records revealed the extensive text message exchanges between Natalie and an unknown number on the night of her death. More than 100 messages had been exchanged between Natalie and someone who investigators would eventually identify as Joseph Lopez. These messages provided a roadmap of their relationship and planning that would become central to building the case against Lopez. The timing of these messages was particularly significant. They showed ongoing communication right up until the time of Natalie's death, suggesting that whoever she was texting with was likely the last person to see her alive. The volume of messages also indicated a substantial relationship between Natalie and her correspondent, not a casual or coincidental encounter. As investigators worked to trace the phone number that had been texting with Natalie, they began to uncover other pieces of the puzzle. Digital forensics experts analyzed the content and timing of the messages, looking for clues about where the correspondents were planning to meet and what they had discussed. Meanwhile, other investigators were working to understand Natalie's state of mind in the days and weeks leading up to her death. They interviewed family members, friends, and acquaintances to build a picture of her mental health struggles, her drug use, and any recent changes in her behavior or circumstances. This investigation revealed the depth of Natalie's struggles with depression and addiction, but also painted a picture of a young woman who was still fighting to build a future for herself. She was working to complete her education, had plans to become a nurse, and had people in her life who cared about her. This made her death even more tragic and raised questions about what had driven her to seek help from a stranger on the internet. The discovery of Natalie's Craigslist advertisements was another crucial piece of the puzzle. The ad, with its shocking title about wanting to put a hit on herself, provided context for the relationship between Natalie and her unknown correspondent. It showed that Natalie had been actively seeking someone to help her die, but it also raised questions about her mental state and capacity to make such a decision. As the investigation progressed, the focus began to shift toward identifying and locating the person who had been communicating with Natalie. The phone number from the text messages became the key to this effort, as investigators worked to trace it back to its owner. This process involved working with phone companies to identify the account holder, analyzing cell tower data to track the movements of the phone, and potentially seeking warrants to access additional records and communications. Each step brought investigators closer to identifying the person who had been with Natalie in her final hours. The investigation also had to grapple with the complex legal and ethical questions raised by Natalie's case. If she had indeed sought out someone to kill her, what were the legal implications? Was this assisted suicide, murder, or something in between? How should investigators and prosecutors approach a case where the victim may have requested her own death? These questions would become even more complex as investigators learned more about the circumstances of Natalie's death, the relationship between her and her killer, and the true nature of what had transpired along Riverdale Road on that December night. The investigation was also complicated by the digital nature of much of the evidence. Text messages, online advertisements, and phone records require specialized expertise to analyze and present in court. Investigators had to work with digital forensics experts to ensure that they could reconstruct the online relationship between Natalie and her killer and present it in a way that would be compelling to a jury. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, investigators started to develop a clearer picture of what had happened to Natalie Bollinger and who was responsible for her death. The breakthrough in the Natalie Bollinger case came when investigators successfully traced the phone number that had been used to exchange more than 100 text messages with Natalie on the night of her death. This digital trail would lead them directly to Joseph Michael Lopez and begin to unravel his carefully constructed story about what had happened along Riverdale Road. Detective Matthew Peterson of the Adams County Sheriff's Office became the lead investigator on the case, and his methodical approach to following the digital evidence would prove crucial to solving Natalie's murder. Peterson and his team worked tirelessly to trace the phone communications and build a comprehensive picture of the relationship between Natalie and her killer. When investigators identified Lopez as the owner of the phone number, they began conducting surveillance and gathering additional evidence about his activities around the time of Natalie's death. They discovered that Lopez had reported his Glock 9mm pistol as stolen shortly after Natalie's murder, a suspicious coincidence that suggested he was trying to distance himself from the weapon used in the crime. The timing of Lopez's gun theft report was particularly damning. He had reported the weapon stolen after Natalie's death, but had been in possession of it at the time of their meeting. According to his own later admissions, this appeared to be a calculated attempt to create an alibi and prevent investigators from connecting him to the murder weapon. As investigators dug deeper into Lopez's background and activities, they began to build a case that would challenge his later claims about helping Natalie with an assisted suicide. The evidence suggested a more sinister motivation for his involvement in her death. When detectives finally approached Lopez for questioning, he initially denied knowing Natalie or having any involvement in her death. This denial was quickly contradicted by the overwhelming digital evidence connecting him to her through their extensive text message exchanges. Faced with this evidence, Lopez changed his story and admitted to meeting with Natalie and shooting her. However, Lopez's admission came with a self-serving narrative. He claimed that Natalie had hired him through her Craigslist advertisement to kill her, that she had paid him for this service, and that he had simply fulfilled her request for assisted suicide. According to Lopez, He was not a murderer, but someone who had compassionately helped a suffering person end their pain. This story, while potentially explaining some of the evidence, raised numerous red flags for investigators. First, assisted suicide was illegal in Colorado, so even if Lopez's story were true, he had still committed a serious crime. Second, the circumstances of the meeting, the remote location, the secrecy, Lopez's flight from the scene, were inconsistent with legal assisted suicide practices in jurisdictions where such procedures were allowed. Most importantly, the forensic evidence from Natalie's autopsy complicated Lopez's narrative significantly. The presence of a potentially lethal amount of heroin in her system at the time of death raised questions about her capacity to consent to her own killing and suggested that the situation may have been more complex than Lopez claimed. Investigators also questioned Lopez's motivation for agreeing to help someone commit suicide. If he genuinely believed he was providing a compassionate service, why did he accept money for it? Why choose such a secretive and remote location? And why did he immediately flee the scene and attempt to cover up his involvement by reporting his gun stolen? The more investigators examined Lopez's story, the more it appeared to be a carefully constructed fiction designed to justify murder. The evidence suggested that Lopez had not responded to Natalie's advertisement out of compassion, but had seen her vulnerability as an opportunity to commit violence while believing he could avoid the consequences. As the case against Lopez strengthened, investigators worked with prosecutors to determine what charges to file. The complexity of the case involving questions of consent, mental health, addiction, and the legality of assisted suicide made it a challenging prosecution to prepare. Ultimately, the evidence against Lopez was strong enough to support charges of first-degree murder. The premeditation evident in his response to Natalie's advertisement, his planning of their meeting, his bringing of a weapon, and his subsequent attempts to cover up his involvement, all pointed to deliberate and calculated murder rather than compassionate assistance with suicide. Detective Peterson's thorough investigation had uncovered the truth behind Natalie's death and provided the evidence needed to hold her killer accountable. The digital trail that had initially seemed to support Lopez's story ultimately became the key to exposing his lies and bringing him to justice. In February 2018, Joseph Michael Lopez was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Natalie Bollinger. The charges reflected the prosecution's belief that Lopez had committed premeditated murder, not the compassionate assisted suicide he claimed to have provided. The decision to charge Lopez with first-degree murder was significant because it required prosecutors to prove that the killing was deliberate and premeditated. This meant they would need to demonstrate that Lopez had planned Natalie's death in advance, rather than acting impulsively or in response to her immediate request. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the digital evidence that investigators had uncovered. The text messages between Lopez and Natalie showed a progression from initial contact through planning their meeting, suggesting deliberate preparation for the crime. The timing and content of these messages would be crucial to establishing premeditation. Lopez's behavior after the shooting also provided evidence of his consciousness of guilt. His flight from the scene, his failure to report the death to authorities, and his attempt to cover up his involvement by reporting his gun stolen, all suggested that he knew he had committed a serious crime. The prosecution also highlighted the power imbalance between Lopez and Natalie at the time of their meeting. While Lopez was relatively stable and armed, Natalie was struggling with addiction and mental health issues, and the autopsy showed she had a potentially lethal amount of heroin in her system at the time of her death. This evidence suggested that she may not have been capable of giving meaningful consent to her own killing. The defense, led by public defenders, faced a challenging case. They had to acknowledge that Lopez had killed Natalie while somehow arguing that his actions were justified or at least not deserving of a first-degree murder conviction. Their strategy focused on Lopez's claim that he was helping Natalie fulfill her own request to die. The defense argued that Natalie's Craigslist advertisement showed her genuine desire to end her life, and that Lopez had simply responded to her request. They suggested that while his actions may have been illegal, they were motivated by a desire to help someone in pain rather than by malicious intents. However, the defense faced several significant challenges. First, they had to explain why Lopez had taken money for this supposed act of compassion. Second, they had to address his behavior after the shooting, which seemed more consistent with someone trying to cover up a crime than someone who believed he had acted legally. Third, they had to contend with the evidence suggesting that Natalie may not have been capable of consenting to her own death due to her mental state and drug use. The case also raised complex legal questions about assisted suicide, murder, and the capacity to consent. While some jurisdictions have legal frameworks for physician-assisted suicide under carefully controlled circumstances, Colorado was not one of them. Even if Lopez's story were entirely true, he would still have committed a serious crime. The prosecution worked to present the case in a way that highlighted Lopez's exploitation of a vulnerable young woman, rather than focusing on the technical legal questions around assisted suicide. They portrayed him as a predator who had taken advantage of Natalie's desperation for his own purposes, whatever those might have been. As the case moved toward trial, both sides prepared to present complex evidence about digital communications, forensic pathology, mental health, and addiction. The jury would need to sort through competing narratives about Lopez's motivations and determine whether his actions constituted premeditated murder or something less serious. The case attracted significant media attention, both because of its unusual circumstances and because it raised broader questions about online safety, mental health resources, and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The story of a teenager seeking a hitman on Craigslist was both shocking and sadly representative of the dangers that young people face in the digital age. Throughout the legal proceedings, Natalie's family worked to keep her memory alive and to ensure that she was remembered as more than just a victim. They spoke about her dreams of becoming a nurse, her intelligence and ambition, and their love for her despite her struggles. Their presence in the courtroom served as a reminder of the human cost of Lopez's actions and the lives that had been destroyed by his decision to exploit rather than help a young woman in crisis. As the case against Joseph Lopez progressed through the legal system, both the prosecution and defense faced the reality of the complex evidence and the challenges of presenting their respective cases to a jury. The unusual circumstances of Natalie's death, involving online communications, mental health issues, addiction, and questions about consent, made this a difficult case to prosecute and defend. In December 2018, nearly a year after Natalie's death, Lopez made a decision that would avoid a trial and bring some closure to the case. Rather than face a jury on the first-degree murder charges, he agreed to accept a plea deal with prosecutors that would result in a guilty plea to second-degree murder. The plea agreement represented a compromise between the prosecution's desire to hold Lopez accountable for Natalie's death and the practical realities of securing a conviction in such a complex case. Second-degree murder, while a serious felony, carries different legal standards than first-degree murder, and acknowledges that while the killing was intentional, it may not have been premeditated in the traditional sense. Under the terms of the plea agreements, Lopez admitted guilt to second-degree murder and related firearms charges. This admission meant that he acknowledged responsibility for Natalie's death, while avoiding the possibility of a life sentence without parole that could have resulted from a first-degree murder conviction. The plea deal also spared Natalie's family the trauma of a lengthy trial where the details of her mental health struggles, addiction, and final days would have been extensively examined in public. Trials in cases like this can be particularly difficult for families, as they must relive the tragedy while hearing defense attorneys potentially criticize or question the victim's choices and mental state. When Lopez appeared for sentencing, the court heard impact statements from Natalie's family that painted a picture of a young woman whose life had been cut tragically short. Her father, Ted Bullinger, spoke about the devastation her death had caused and the potential she had shown despite her struggles. The family's statements highlighted not just their loss, but their love for Natalie and their belief that she deserved better than the exploitation she had encountered in her final days. The prosecution argued for a significant sentence that would reflect the seriousness of Lopez's crime and his exploitation of a vulnerable young woman. They emphasized that regardless of what Natalie may have requested, Lopez had taken advantage of someone in crisis rather than seeking to help her find resources and support. In January 2019, Lopez was sentenced to 48 years in prison with the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the court's view that Lopez's actions constituted a serious crime that warranted significant punishment, while acknowledging the complex circumstances surrounding Natalie's death. The 48-year sentence meant that Lopez, who was 23 at the time of sentencing, would likely spend most or all of his remaining adult life in prison. Even with the possibility of parole, he would not be eligible for release until he was well into middle age, ensuring that he would face substantial consequences for his decision to kill Natalie rather than help her. For Natalie's family, the sentencing provided a measure of justice, but it could never restore what they had lost. Their daughter, sister, and granddaughter was gone, and no prison sentence could bring her back or heal the wounds left by her violent death. The sentencing also provided some measure of closure to the legal proceedings, but it left many questions unanswered about the true nature of what had happened between Lopez and Natalie on that December night. While Lopez had admitted to killing her, his self-serving narrative about providing assisted suicide remained disputed by the evidence and by those who knew and loved Natalie. Throughout the legal proceedings and beyond, Natalie Bollinger's family faced the impossible task of grieving their daughter, while watching her story become public fodder and her memory distorted by the circumstances of her death. The family's pain was compounded by the way the case was often portrayed in media coverage, which sometimes seemed to focus more on the sensational aspects of the Craigslist connection than on the loss of a young woman with dreams and potential. Natalie's mother, Rose Self, spoke powerfully about her daughter in the aftermath of the sentencing. "I'm proud she was mine," she told reporters. All of the work that she had done and all of the plans she made and everything, she was about to get catapulted into all of that. And she was super excited for her life. These words painted a picture of a young woman who, despite her struggles, had been looking forward to her future and working toward her goals. The family's statements during the legal proceedings revealed the complexity of their grief. They mourned not just the loss of Natalie's life, but the loss of the person she could have become. Her dreams of becoming a nurse, her intelligence, her caring nature, all of these qualities were cut short by Lopez's decision to exploit rather than help her in her moment of crisis. Rose Self lived in Portsmouth, Virginia, but had maintained a close relationship with her daughter, despite the geographical distance. The family had to navigate their grief, while also dealing with the media attention and public speculation about Natalie's mental state and the circumstances of her death. This added layer of public scrutiny made their mourning even more difficult. The case also highlighted the additional trauma that families face when their loved one's death becomes the subject of true crime fascination. Social media played a significant role in the investigation and public discussion of Natalie's case, with Facebook and other platforms becoming venues for both helpful information sharing and harmful speculation. The family had to watch as strangers debated their daughter's state of mind, questioned her decisions, and offered theories about what had really happened. Some family members revealed additional context that painted an even more troubling picture of Natalie's final weeks. Reports indicated that Natalie had been dealing with a stalker and had been granted a permanent restraining order against this individual just over 2 weeks before she disappeared. This information suggested that Natalie had been dealing with multiple sources of stress and fear in her final days, adding another layer of vulnerability that Lopez had exploited. The family's advocacy during the legal proceedings focused on ensuring that Lopez faced appropriate consequences for his actions, but they also worked to counter the narrative that Natalie had simply hired someone to kill her. They knew their daughter as someone who was fighting to overcome her struggles, not someone who had given up on life entirely. The public response to the case was mixed, reflecting society's complex attitudes toward mental health, addiction, and personal responsibility. Some people expressed sympathy for Natalie and anger at Lopez for taking advantage of a vulnerable young woman. Others questioned why she had turned to Craigslist rather than seeking professional help, sometimes seeming to suggest that she bore some responsibility for her own death. This victim-blaming response was particularly painful for Natalie's family, who understood the complexity of mental health struggles and addiction. They knew that depression and addiction can make it difficult for people to make rational decisions or seek appropriate help, and they were frustrated by suggestions that Natalie should have somehow known better or done things differently. The case also sparked broader discussions about online safety, particularly for young people struggling with mental health issues. Natalie's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking help from strangers on the internet. But it also highlighted the gaps in mental health resources and support systems that leave vulnerable people with few options for help. For the family, the sentencing marked the end of the legal proceedings, but not the end of their journey with grief and healing. They continued to advocate for Natalie's memory and to work toward ensuring that her story might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The murder of Natalie Bollinger extends far beyond the specific tragedy of one young woman's death. Her case serves as a stark illustration of multiple societal failures and dangerous intersections in our modern world. The exploitation of vulnerable individuals online, the inadequacy of mental health resources, the predatory nature of some who lurk in digital spaces, and the complex relationship between consent and capacity in extreme circumstances. One of the most disturbing aspects of Natalie's case is how it reveals the hunting grounds that exist within seemingly innocuous online platforms. Craigslist, which was designed as a community bulletin board for legitimate transactions and connections, had become a space where predators could identify and target vulnerable individuals. Lopez's response to Natalie's advertisement shows how online anonymity can enable people to present false personas and exploit others' desperation. The case also highlighted the digital divide in how we understand and address mental health crises in the internet age. While technology has created new resources for mental health support, crisis hotlines, online therapy, support communities, it has also created new avenues for exploitation. Young people in crisis may be more likely to seek help anonymously online rather than from family, friends, or professionals. But this apparent safety can actually expose them to greater danger. As prosecutors noted during the sentencing, Lopez had responded to Natalie's cry for help as a predator rather than a human being. This observation cuts to the heart of what made Lopez's actions so reprehensible. When confronted with someone in obvious distress and crisis, he chose to exploit rather than help, to harm rather than heal. The forensic evidence in Natalie's case, particularly the presence of a potentially lethal amount of heroin in her system, raises complex questions about consent and capacity. Even if we accept Lopez's claim that Natalie had requested his help in dying, the evidence suggests she may not have been in a mental state to give meaningful consent to such a decision. This intersection of mental illness, addiction, and alleged consent creates a legal and ethical minefield that her case forced courts to navigate. Natalie's story also illuminates the particular vulnerabilities faced by young adults who are struggling with both mental health issues and substance abuse. This population often falls through cracks in support systems too old for many youth services, but often lacking the stability and resources to access adult mental health care effectively. The combination of depression, addiction, and the developmental challenges of early adulthood can create a perfect storm of vulnerability. The case raised important questions about how society responds to suicide and suicidal ideation. While there has been increased awareness about mental health issues in recent years, Natalie's turn to a Craigslist advertisements suggests that existing resources and support systems may not be reaching all the people who need them. Her story highlights the need for more accessible, anonymous, and non-judgmental mental health resources, particularly for young adults struggling with addiction. The geographical aspects of the case, the remote location where Natalie was killed, the suburban communities where both she and Lopez lived, also speak to how isolation can facilitate violence. Lopez chose a location where there would be no witnesses, no chance for intervention, and no immediate help available. This calculated choice of location further undermines his claims about providing compassionate assistance. From a legal perspective, Natalie's case contributed to ongoing discussions about assisted suicide, murder, and the boundaries between them. Even in jurisdictions where physician-assisted suicide is legal, it operates under strict protocols designed to ensure that patients are making informed voluntary decisions while mentally competent. The circumstances of Natalie's death involving a stranger, payment, secrecy, evidence of impaired judgment bore no resemblance to legitimate assisted dying practices. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement in investigating crimes that originate in digital spaces. The text message evidence that proved crucial to solving Natalie's murder required specialized expertise to recover, analyze, and present in court. As more crimes involve digital communication, law enforcement agencies must continue to develop their capabilities in digital forensics and online investigation. For families dealing with similar situations, Natalie's case offers both warnings and resources. It demonstrates the importance of taking online safety seriously, particularly for young people who may be vulnerable due to mental health or substance abuse issues. It also shows the need for families to be aware of the warning signs of both predatory behavior and mental health crises. The media coverage of Natalie's case also raised questions about how society discusses and sensationalizes crimes involving vulnerable victims. The focus on the Craigslist angle sometimes overshadowed the human tragedy at the center of the story, potentially contributing to harmful stereotypes about mental illness and addiction. As we reach the end of Natalie Bollinger's story, it's important to remember that behind the headlines, the legal proceedings, and the broader societal implications was a real person. A 19-year-old woman with dreams, struggles, and people who loved her. Her life was more than the circumstances of her death, and her memory deserves to be honored in ways that go beyond the tragedy that ended her life. Natalie was someone who had overcome significant challenges in her young life, The frequent moves, family instability, and personal struggles she faced would have defeated many people, but she had managed to excel academically and earn a scholarship to pursue her dream of becoming a nurse. This achievement speaks to her resilience, determination, and fundamental desire to help others, qualities that make her death all the more tragic. Her dream of becoming a nurse is particularly poignant when considered alongside the circumstances of her death. Natalie wanted to dedicate her life to caring for others, to healing and helping people in their times of greatest need. Instead, she encountered someone who saw her own time of greatest need as an opportunity for exploitation and violence. The contrast between Natalie's aspirations and the reality of how her life ended serves as a powerful reminder of the potential that was lost when Joseph Lopez chose to respond to her cry for help with violence rather than compassion. Every life cut short represents not just the loss of who that person was, but the loss of who they might have become. For her family, keeping Natalie's memory alive means more than just seeking justice for her death. It means ensuring that people remember her for who she was as a person. She was intelligent, caring, ambitious, and loved. She was struggling with very real challenges, but she was also working to overcome them and build a future for herself. Natalie's story also serves as a call to action for all of us who encounter people in crisis. When we meet someone who is struggling with mental health issues, addiction, or suicidal thoughts, we have a choice about how to respond. We can choose compassion over exploitation, help over harm, connection over isolation. Her case highlights the critical importance of mental health resources and the need for society to do better in supporting young people who are struggling. It shows the dangers that exist in online spaces and the need for greater awareness about digital safety. Most importantly, it demonstrates the devastating consequences when predators are allowed to exploit the vulnerable. If Natalie's story can serve any positive purpose, it should be to inspire greater compassion for those who are struggling, increased vigilance about online safety, and improved support systems for people dealing with mental health and addiction issues. It should remind us that behind every crime statistic is a real person with a real story, and that every person deserves help rather than exploitation in their darkest moments. As we remember Natalie Bollinger, let us honor her memory not just by seeking justice for her death, but by working to create a world where vulnerable young people can find help rather than predators when they reach out for assistance. Let us remember her dreams, her potential, and her fundamental humanity. And let us work to ensure that other families don't have to endure the pain that hers has suffered. In the end, Natalie's story is both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder of how quickly a life can be lost when desperation meets exploitation, but also a call to action for all of us to do better in protecting and supporting the most vulnerable members of our communities. Her memory deserves nothing less than our commitment to creating a safer, more compassionate world for those who are struggling to find their way. This has been the story of Natalie Bollinger, a young woman whose life was tragically cut short, but whose memory continues to serve as both a warning and an inspiration. May she rest in peace, and may her story help protect others from similar tragedies. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 4. Tonight we travel to Raleigh, North Carolina, where the magnolia trees bloom white against brick, colonial homes, and where Southern hospitality masks darker truths that sometimes lurk behind closed doors. This is the story of Lauren Hugelmeyer, a 29-year-old woman whose bright smile and generous heart made her beloved by everyone who knew her. It's also the story of how someone who claimed to love her most would become the architect of her destruction. Lauren's story, though tragic, reminds us of the strength of the human spirit, the importance of recognizing warning signs, and the enduring power of love that continues even after death. In the early morning hours of September 1st, 2017, a 911 call would shatter the quiet of a Raleigh neighborhood and reveal a crime so brutal, so senseless, that it would capture national attention and forever change the lives of everyone who loved Lauren Hugelmeyer. Lauren Hugelmeyer was the kind of person who made every room brighter simply by walking into it. Born and raised with Midwestern values, she carried herself with a warmth and authenticity that drew people to her like moths to a flame. At 29 years old, Lauren had built a life centered around service to others, faith, and the simple joy of making connections with the people around her. Those who knew Lauren described her as fiercely independent and incredibly hardworking. She wasn't someone who waited for opportunities to come to her. She created them. While others her age might have been focused solely on their own advancement, Lauren found fulfillment in helping others achieve their dreams and navigate their challenges. Lauren worked as a Sunday school teacher, a role that perfectly suited her nurturing personality and deep faith. Children were naturally drawn to her patient demeanor and genuine interest in their thoughts and feelings. She had a gift for making Bible stories come alive for young minds, using her creativity and enthusiasm to help children understand complex concepts of faith, love, and forgiveness. Her teaching wasn't limited to Sunday mornings. Lauren took on additional jobs to support herself and her household, demonstrating the work ethic and determination that had been instilled in her from childhood. She understood the value of hard work and took pride in her ability to provide for herself and contribute to her community. Family was central to Lauren's world. She maintained close relationships with her parents, Dale and Lori Hugelmeyer, who had raised her to be strong, compassionate, and independent. They had watched their daughter grow into a remarkable woman who embodied the values they had tried to instill in her throughout her childhood. Dale Hugelmeyer, Lauren's father, was particularly proud of his daughter's accomplishments and her character. He saw in her a reflection of the best qualities he and his wife had tried to nurture: kindness without naivety, strength without hardness, and faith without judgment. The bond between father and daughter was strong, built on mutual respect, shared values, and unconditional love. Lori, Lauren's mother, shared a special connection with her daughter that went beyond the typical mother-daughter relationship. They were friends and confidants, sharing hopes, dreams, fears, and everyday experiences. Lori had watched Lauren navigate the challenges of young adulthood with grace and wisdom, always available to offer guidance when asked, but respecting her daughter's independence and decision-making abilities. Lauren's faith wasn't just something she practiced on Sundays. It was woven into the fabric of her daily life. She believed in the power of love to overcome hatred, in the importance of forgiveness, and in the fundamental goodness of people. This faith would make her vulnerable to manipulation by someone who understood how to exploit her trusting nature and desire to see the best in others. The Raleigh community where Lauren lived was the perfect setting for someone with her values and interests. North Carolina's capital city offered a blend of urban sophistication and southern charm, with a strong sense of community and numerous opportunities for someone like Lauren to make a positive impact. The city's many churches, community organizations, and volunteer opportunities provided outlets for her desire to serve others. In the months leading up to her death, Lauren's life seemed to be following a path that would lead to happiness and fulfillment. She was engaged in meaningful work, surrounded by a loving family, and actively involved in her church community. From the outside, it appeared that Lauren had found the balance many people spend their entire lives seeking. Lauren's introduction to Matthew Phelps seemed like something out of a romantic novel. He was studying to become a pastor, pursuing missions and evangelism at Clear Creek Baptist Bible College. On paper, he appeared to be everything Lauren might have wanted in a partner, someone who shared her faith, her values, and her commitment to serving others. Matthew presented himself as a dedicated student of theology, someone who had felt called to ministry and was seriously preparing for a life of spiritual leadership. He spoke eloquently about his faith, his desire to help others, and his vision for using his pastoral training to make a positive impact in the world. To Lauren, who valued authenticity and spiritual depth, Matthew seemed like an answer to prayer. Their courtship unfolded in the familiar patterns of church romance: shared Bible studies, participation in church activities, long conversations about faith and the future. Matthew was attentive and romantic, showering Lauren with the kind of attention that made her feel special and valued. He seemed to understand her heart and her dreams in ways that previous relationships had not. The early stages of their relationship were characterized by what appeared to be genuine compatibility. They shared similar values, enjoyed each other's company, and seemed to complement each other well. Matthew's theological studies impressed Lauren's family and friends, who saw in him someone who would be able to provide spiritual leadership in their marriage and future family. Matthew was skilled at presenting his best self during this courtship period. He was charming, thoughtful, and seemingly devoted to Lauren. He understood the importance of making a good impression on her family and worked hard to establish himself as someone worthy of their daughter's love. His efforts were successful. Lauren's family initially welcomed him and were optimistic about the relationship. The progression from dating to engagement happened relatively quickly, as is often the case with couples who meet in religious contexts and feel pressure to move toward marriage rather than prolonged dating relationships. Matthew proposed and Lauren accepted, believing that she had found her soulmate and life partner. Their engagement period was filled with wedding planning, discussions about their future together, and continued participation in church activities. Lauren threw herself into preparations for their new life together, making plans for their home, discussing their shared goals, and looking forward to the ministry work they might do as a married couple. The wedding took place in November 2016, surrounded by family and friends, who celebrated what appeared to be the union of two people perfectly suited for each other. The ceremony was beautiful. The couple seemed radiant, and all signs pointed to a happy future together. Wedding photos from that day show Lauren glowing with happiness, her smile radiant as she looked toward her new husband and their life together. In the immediate aftermath of their wedding, the couple settled into married life in Raleigh. They found a home on Patuxent Drive, a quiet residential street that seemed perfect for a young couple starting their life together. The neighborhood was safe, family-friendly, and close to the church where they were both involved in various ministries. Lauren continued her work as a Sunday school teacher while supporting Matthew's ongoing pastoral studies. She took on additional jobs to help support their household financially, demonstrating her commitment to their partnership and her willingness to sacrifice for their shared goals. Her independence and work ethic, which had always been sources of strength, became even more important as she worked to build a stable foundation for their marriage. For a brief period, their marriage appeared to be everything Lauren had hoped it would be. They participated in church activities together, socialized with other couples, and seemed to be building the kind of faith-centered marriage that Lauren had always dreamed of having. As the initial honeymoon period of their marriage began to fade, cracks started to appear in the seemingly perfect facade that Matthew had maintained during their courtship. The charming, attentive man Lauren had fallen in love with began to reveal aspects of his personality that were darker, more controlling, and deeply troubling. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Small incidents that Lauren might have dismissed as stress from Matthew's studies, or the normal adjustments that come with married life. Matthew became increasingly critical of Lauren, finding fault with things that had never been issues before. Her independence, which had initially attracted him, now seemed to irritate him. Matthew's behavior began to follow patterns common in abusive relationships. He would create conflict over minor issues, escalate arguments beyond what the situation warranted, and then apologize profusely, promising that his behavior would change. These cycles of tension, explosion, and reconciliation kept Lauren off balance and gradually eroded her confidence in her own perceptions. Lauren's family began to notice changes in their daughter during visits and phone calls. The vibrant, confident woman they had raised seemed increasingly anxious and uncertain. She made excuses for Matthew's behavior, defended him when others expressed concern, and gradually became more isolated from the support systems that had always been important to her. The isolation wasn't accidental. Matthew systematically worked to distance Lauren from her family and friends, using techniques that are hallmarks of emotional abuse. He would create conflicts before family visits, making it difficult for Lauren to enjoy time with her loved ones. He would criticize her relationships with others, planting seeds of doubt about their motives and loyalty. One of the most disturbing revelations that would later come to light was that Matthew had not been truthful about his past. Lauren discovered that he had been previously married, and that his first marriage had ended under circumstances that were far different from what he had told her. The discovery of his deception was devastating for Lauren, who valued honesty and authenticity above almost everything else. Even more alarming were the details Lauren learned about Matthew's previous marriage. According to information that would later emerge, Matthew had exhibited controlling and abusive behavior toward his first wife as well. There were allegations of physical violence, emotional manipulation, and the same patterns of behavior that Lauren was beginning to experience in her own marriage. The discovery of Matthew's hidden past was a turning point for Lauren. The man she had married, the aspiring pastor who had seemed to share her values and her faith, was revealed to be someone entirely different. The foundation of trust upon which their marriage had been built was completely undermined by these revelations. Lauren began to confide in her family about the problems in her marriage. These conversations were difficult for everyone involved. Lauren was embarrassed and confused about how she had been so thoroughly deceived. while her family struggled with their own feelings of helplessness and regret about not seeing the warning signs earlier. The psychological impact of discovering that her husband had systematically lied to her about his past was profound. Lauren had to reconcile the man she thought she had married with the reality of who Matthew actually was. This cognitive dissonance created enormous stress and contributed to her growing realization that her marriage was not salvageable. As Lauren grappled with these revelations, Matthew's behavior became even more erratic and concerning. The mask of the charming spiritual man was slipping away, revealing someone who was capable of manipulation, deception, and violence. The pattern of abuse was escalating, and Lauren found herself trapped in a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous. Friends and family members who had initially been impressed by Matthew began to see through his carefully constructed persona. His behavior toward Lauren became more obviously controlling and inappropriate, even in social settings. The contrast between his public image as an aspiring pastor and his private behavior toward his wife became impossible to ignore. By the summer of 2017, Lauren's marriage had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer pretend that things might improve. The accumulation of Matthew's deceptions, his controlling behavior, and his increasingly erratic moods had convinced her that she needed to end the relationship for her own safety and well-being. The decision to leave a marriage is never easy, but for someone like Lauren, who took her vows seriously and believed in the power of love and forgiveness, it was particularly difficult. She had invested everything in this relationship, had supported Matthew through his studies, and had genuinely tried to make their marriage work despite the mounting evidence that he was not the man she had thought she was marrying. Lauren's family became increasingly concerned about her safety as they witnessed the escalation in Matthew's behavior. What had started as emotional abuse and manipulation was showing signs of potentially becoming physical violence. The patterns they were observing were consistent with domestic violence situations that can quickly turn deadly. Gail and Lori Hugelmeyer found themselves in the impossible position of wanting to protect their daughter while respecting her autonomy as an adult. They offered support, expressed their concerns, and made it clear that they would help her in any way possible if she decided to leave the marriage. Their love for Lauren was unconditional, and they wanted nothing more than for her to be safe and happy. In the weeks leading up to her death, Lauren made several comments to family members that suggested she was preparing to end her marriage. She spoke about being done with the relationship and indicated that she was ready to take steps to protect herself and move forward with her life. These conversations would later haunt her family, who wondered if they could have done more to help her escape the dangerous situation she was in. The final weeks of Lauren's life were marked by increasing tension in the marriage. Matthew seemed to sense that Lauren was pulling away from him, and his behavior became even more unpredictable and controlling. He would alternate between attempts to win her back and angry outbursts that revealed the depth of his instability. One particularly troubling incident occurred shortly before Lauren's death, when Matthew left their home to spend time with another woman. This betrayal was the final straw for Lauren, who had already endured so much deception and manipulation. Family members later recalled that this incident seemed to crystallize Lauren's resolve to end the marriage once and for all. Lauren's mental and emotional state during this period was complex. She was grieving the loss of the marriage she had hoped to have, processing the trauma of discovering that her husband had systematically deceived her, and trying to find the strength to rebuild her life. Despite these challenges, she was demonstrating remarkable courage in her decision to leave an increasingly dangerous situation. The summer of 2017 was hot and humid in Raleigh, with long days that seemed to drag by under the weight of the oppressive heat. For Lauren, each day brought new clarity about the necessity of ending her marriage, but also new anxiety about how Matthew might react to her decision. She was walking a tightrope, trying to protect herself while not provoking him into more dangerous behavior. Matthew's obsession with violent media, particularly the movie American Psycho, became more apparent during this period. This fixation on a film about a psychopathic killer was deeply troubling to those who knew about it, especially given the escalating tensions in his marriage. The line between fantasy and reality seemed to be blurring for Matthew in ways that would prove to have deadly consequences. As August turned into September, Lauren was making concrete plans to leave her marriage. She had begun to take steps to protect herself financially and emotionally, preparing for the difficult process of divorce and the rebuilding of her life. What she couldn't have known was that Matthew was also making plans that would ensure she would never have the chance to leave him. September 1st, 2017. began like countless other late summer days in Raleigh. The morning air carried the first hints that autumn might eventually break the grip of the oppressive heat that had dominated the region for months. In the Phelps household on Patuxent Drive, however, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The tensions that had been building in Lauren and Matthew's marriage had reached a breaking point. The previous evening's incident, where Matthew had left to spend time with another woman, had served as the final confirmation for Lauren that her marriage was over. The betrayal, coming on top of all the deception and manipulation she had already endured, had crystallized her resolve to end the relationship. For Lauren, the decision brought a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because she would finally be free from the psychological prison that her marriage had become. Anxiety because she knew that Matthew would not accept her decision gracefully, and she feared how he might react when confronted with the reality that she was leaving him. The day progressed with an undercurrent of tension that both Lauren and Matthew could feel. Conversations were strained. Normal activities felt loaded with unspoken conflict, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the confrontation that both knew was coming. Matthew's behavior throughout the day was erratic, even by his recent standards. He alternated between attempts to act normal and moments of barely contained agitation. His mental state seemed to be deteriorating rapidly, as if the prospect of losing control over Lauren was triggering a psychological collapse that would have devastating consequences. As evening approached, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Lauren was preparing for what she knew would be a difficult conversation, one that would officially end her marriage and begin the process of extricating herself from the dangerous situation she had found herself in. She had no way of knowing that Matthew had already made his own decision about how this confrontation would end. The details of what happened inside the house on Patuxent Drive that night would later be reconstructed through physical evidence, Matthew's own statements, and the horrific scene that first responders discovered. What began as a marital dispute escalated into violence of such brutality that it would shock even experienced law enforcement professionals. The attack on Lauren was sustained, vicious, and personal. The wounds she sustained told a story of rage, control, and the complete abandonment of any semblance of humanity. Matthew didn't just kill his wife. He destroyed her in a frenzy of violence that spoke to the depth of his psychological disturbance and his need to completely dominate and control her, even in death. The physical evidence at the scene painted a picture of a woman who had fought for her life against someone who was determined to end it. Lauren's defensive wounds indicated that she had tried to protect herself, that she had struggled against her attacker, and that she had not given up easily. Her final moments were a testament to her strength and her will to survive, even in the face of overwhelming violence. As the attack continued, neighbors in the quiet residential area remained unaware of the horror unfolding just doors away from their own homes. The house on Patuxent Drive kept its terrible secret, its walls containing screams that no one heard and violence that no one witnessed. When the brutality finally ended, Lauren Hugelmeyer Phelps was dead, her life cut short at 29 years old by the man who had promised to love and protect her. The dreams she had harbored, the plans she had made, the future she had envisioned, all of it died with her in that house, where she had tried so hard to build a happy marriage. At 1:17 a.m. on September 1st, 2017, the silence of the night in Raleigh was broken by a 911 call that would immediately capture the attention of dispatchers, first responders, and ultimately the entire nation. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Matthew Phelps, and his words would set the stage for one of the most controversial defense strategies in recent memory. "I think I killed my wife," Matthew told the dispatcher, his voice carrying what seemed to be confusion and distress. But these words were just the beginning of a narrative that would become increasingly bizarre and ultimately unbelievable as more details emerged about the crime scene and the circumstances surrounding Lauren's death. Matthew's explanation for what had happened was as unusual as it was convenient. He claimed that he had taken cold medicine, specifically quercetin, an over-the-counter medication containing dextromethorphan, and that this medication had somehow caused him to enter a dissociative state during which he had killed his wife, without any memory of doing so. The cold medicine defense that Matthew presented to dispatchers and later to investigators was unprecedented in its audacity. He painted himself as a victim of pharmaceutical side effects, someone who had unknowingly ingested a substance that had transformed him into a killer against his will. This narrative allowed him to acknowledge that he had killed Lauren, while simultaneously claiming that he bore no responsibility for his actions. During the 911 call, Matthew's demeanor was noted by dispatchers as being strangely calm for someone who had just discovered that he had allegedly killed his wife. His emotional responses seemed disconnected from the gravity of the situation he was describing, rather than the panic, grief, or horror that might be expected from someone in his claimed circumstances. Matthew sounded almost detached from the reality of what he was reporting. The responding officers arrived at the house on Patuxent Drive to find a scene that contradicted much of Matthew's narrative. The level of violence that had been inflicted on Lauren was far beyond what might be expected from someone in a confused, medicated state. The attack had been sustained, methodical, and personal in ways that suggested consciousness, intent, and a level of rage that was incompatible with Matthew's claims of drug-induced confusion. Lauren's body bore evidence of an attack that was both brutal and intimate. She had been stabbed 23 times, with wounds covering her head, neck, and arms. Some of the wounds were 4 inches deep, indicating the tremendous force that had been used in the attack. The pattern and location of the wounds suggested someone who was not only conscious, but actively engaged in causing maximum damage to the victim. The defensive wounds on Lauren's arms and hands told the story of a woman who had fought desperately for her life. These injuries indicated that she had been conscious and aware during the attack, that she had tried to protect herself from the knife, and that the assault had lasted long enough for her to mount a sustained defense. This evidence painted a picture that was completely at odds with Matthew's claim of a brief, confused episode. First responders noted several details about the crime scene that raised immediate questions about Matthew's version of events. His clothing showed minimal blood spatter despite his claim to have been the one wielding the knife. The scene itself showed signs of what appeared to be deliberate staging, as if someone had tried to create a specific impression about what had occurred. Matthew's behavior with first responders continued to strike investigators as unusual, rather than showing the kind of emotional devastation that might be expected from someone who had just realized they had killed their spouse. He seemed primarily concerned with explaining his theory about the cold medicine and establishing his version of events. His priorities seemed to be focused on self-preservation rather than grief for his deceased wife. The investigation began immediately, with detectives working to verify Matthew's claims about his medication use, his activities prior to the attack, and his mental state during the relevant time period. They would discover that the cold medicine defense, while creative, was not supported by the available scientific evidence or by the physical realities of the crime scene. As investigators began their work at the crime scene on Patuxent Drive, it became immediately apparent that Matthew Phelps's cold medicine explanation was inconsistent with the physical evidence they were documenting. The brutality of the attack, the number of wounds, and the pattern of violence all suggested a level of consciousness and intent that was incompatible with his claims of drug-induced confusion. The Raleigh Police Department's investigation was thorough and methodical, focusing on both the physical evidence at the scene and the background information that might help explain what had really happened in the Phelps household. Detectives interviewed neighbors, family members, and friends, gradually building a picture of a marriage that had been in serious trouble for months. One of the most significant discoveries during the investigation was the revelation of Matthew's obsession with the movie American Psycho. His 2000 film, starring Christian Bale as a Wall Street executive who is also a serial killer, features graphic depictions of violence against women and explores themes of superficial charm masking psychopathic behavior. The parallels between the film's protagonist and Matthew's own behavior were too striking to ignore. Investigators learned that Matthew had watched American Psycho repeatedly to the point where his fascination with the film had become noticeable to others. This obsession was particularly troubling given the nature of the violence inflicted on Lauren and the way Matthew had initially presented himself as a charming, spiritual man while harboring darker impulses beneath the surface. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Matthew had deceived Lauren about his past, particularly regarding his previous marriage. Detectives discovered that his first marriage had ended amid allegations of domestic violence, information that Matthew had concealed from Lauren and her family. This pattern of deception and violence suggested that Lauren's murder was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a long-standing pattern of abusive behavior. Forensic analysis of the crime scene provided additional evidence that contradicted Matthew's claims. The blood spatter patterns, the location and nature of the wounds, and the position of Lauren's body all suggested a sustained, deliberate attack rather than a brief episode of confused violence. The evidence painted a picture of someone who was fully aware of what they were doing and who had continued the attack long past the point where Lauren posed any threats. Medical experts consulted during the investigation expressed skepticism about Matthew's cold medicine defense. While dextromethorphan, the active ingredient in quercetin, can cause dissociative effects when taken in large quantities, the symptoms typically associated with such overdoses do not include the kind of sustained, coordinated violence that had been inflicted on Lauren. The drug is more likely to cause confusion, hallucinations, and impaired motor function than homicidal rage. The investigation also revealed troubling details about Matthew's behavior in the days and weeks leading up to Lauren's murder. Family members reported that he had seemed increasingly agitated and unstable, particularly after Lauren had begun to distance herself from the marriage. His reaction to the prospect of losing control over his wife appeared to have triggered a psychological crisis that culminated in violence. Detectives interviewed Lauren's family members, who provided crucial information about the deteriorating state of her marriage and her plans to leave Matthew. These conversations revealed that Lauren had been preparing to end the relationship and had expressed fear about how Matthew might react to her decision. Her family's concerns about her safety proved to be tragically prescient. The investigation team also examined Matthew's computer and phone records, looking for additional evidence about his mental state and his activities prior to the murder. They found evidence of his continued obsession with violent media and discovered communications that suggested he was aware that his marriage was ending and was becoming increasingly desperate to maintain control over Lauren. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the cold medicine defense was not only unsupported by the evidence, but was actually contradicted by multiple aspects of the case. The level of planning evident in Matthew's behavior, the nature of the attack itself, and his actions both before and after the murder, all suggested someone who was fully conscious and aware of their actions. The case began to attract national media attention, both because of the unusual nature of Matthew's defense and because of the extreme brutality of the crime. The story of the aspiring pastor who claimed cold medicine had made him kill his wife, captured public interest, and sparked discussions about domestic violence, manipulation, and the lengths to which some perpetrators will go to avoid responsibility for their actions. Matthew Phelps was charged with first-degree murder in connection with Lauren's death, a charge that reflected prosecutors' belief that the killing had been premeditated and deliberate rather than the result of drug-induced confusion. The decision to pursue the most serious charge available demonstrated the confidence that law enforcement had in their case against Matthew. The legal proceedings that followed would become a battle between Matthew's claim of pharmaceutical-induced temporary insanity and the prosecution's argument that he had deliberately murdered his wife in a fit of rage over her decision to leave the marriage. The case would ultimately hinge on whether a jury would believe that cold medicine could cause the kind of sustained brutal violence that had been inflicted on Lauren. Matthew's defense team faced the challenging task of convincing a court that their client's actions were the result of an unforeseeable drug reaction rather than premeditated murder. They would need to overcome significant scientific skepticism about their theory while also explaining away the numerous pieces of evidence that suggested consciousness and intent on Matthew's part. The prosecution, led by Wake County prosecutors, built their case on the physical evidence from the crime scene, the testimony of Lauren's family members about the state of the marriage, and expert testimony about the implausibility of Matthew's cold medicine claims. They argued that Matthew had killed Lauren because he could not accept that she was leaving him, and that his drug defense was simply a calculated attempt to avoid responsibility for his action. As the case proceeded through the legal system, Lauren's family found themselves reliving the trauma of her death through court proceedings, media coverage, and public discussions about the case. They had to endure hearing the details of Lauren's final moments, defending her memory against attempts to blame her for her own death, and watching as Matthew's defense team tried to portray him as a victim rather than a perpetrator. The media attention surrounding the case brought both benefits and challenges for Lauren's family. On one hand, the coverage kept Lauren's story in the public eye and helped educate people about the warning signs of domestic violence. On the other hand, it meant that private family grief became public spectacle, and that Lauren's family had to navigate their loss under intense scrutiny. Public opinion about the case was largely skeptical of Matthew's defense from the beginning. The extreme nature of the violence, combined with the convenient timing of his claimed memory loss, struck many observers as implausible. Social media discussions about the case were overwhelmingly critical of Matthew's attempts to avoid responsibility for his actions. For more than a year, Matthew maintained his innocence and continued to claim that cold medicine had caused him to kill Lauren without his knowledge or intent. This position required him and his legal team to consistently argue that he was as much a victim of the situation as Lauren herself. A claim that became increasingly difficult to sustain as more evidence emerged about his history of deception and manipulation. The strain of maintaining his defense while facing overwhelming evidence of his guilt eventually began to take its toll on Matthew. The prospect of going to trial, where the full extent of his violence against Lauren would be presented to a jury, may have contributed to his eventual decision to change his plea and accept responsibility for his actions. In October 2018, more than a year after Lauren's death, Matthew Phelps appeared in court and made a decision that surprised many observers who had followed the case. Rather than continuing to maintain his innocence and pursue his cold medicine defense, he chose to plead guilty to first-degree murder. Matthew's plea hearing was attended by Lauren's family members, who had waited more than a year to hear him accept responsibility for what he had done to their daughter, sister, and friend. His words in court, while finally acknowledging his guilt, could never undo the damage he had caused or bring Lauren back to the people who loved her. The guilty plea meant that Matthew would serve life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person the way he had harmed Lauren. For her family, the plea brought a measure of justice, though it could never fully compensate for their enormous loss. Matthew Phelps's confession in court was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the end of the legal proceedings that had kept Lauren's family in limbo for more than a year. But it also marked the beginning of their efforts to ensure that Lauren's death would have meaning and might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. During his plea hearing, Matthew finally abandoned the cold medicine defense that had defined his case for over a year. Standing before the court, he admitted that he was responsible for Lauren's death and expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse for his actions. "I feel like a monster," he told the court. Words that reflected the reality of what he had done to the woman who had loved and trusted him. For Lauren's family, Matthew's confession brought a complex mixture of emotions. While they were grateful that he had finally accepted responsibility for his actions, his words could never undo the damage he had caused or bring back the daughter, sister, and friend they had lost. The confession provided closure in legal terms, but the emotional wounds would take much longer to heal. Dale Hugelmeyer, Lauren's father, made it clear that while justice had been served, forgiveness was not something he was prepared to offer. His statement that he would never forgive Matthew and would take him to my grave reflected the depth of his pain and the permanence of the loss that Matthew's actions had caused. This response highlighted the lasting impact that violent crime has on victims' families, extending far beyond the immediate tragedy. Lauren's family channeled their grief into advocacy work, speaking publicly about domestic violence and the warning signs that others should watch for in their own relationships or those of their loved ones. They participated in interviews, supported domestic violence awareness campaigns, and worked to ensure that Lauren's story would serve as a cautionary tale for other families. The case became an important example in discussions about domestic violence, particularly the way that abusers can present themselves as charming, spiritual, or otherwise desirable partners while hiding their true nature. Matthew's ability to deceive Lauren and her family for so long illustrated the sophisticated manipulation tactics that many abusers employ to maintain control over their victims. Lauren's memory was honored through various tributes and memorials that celebrated her life, rather than focusing solely on her death. Friends and family shared stories about her kindness, her faith, her dedication to helping others, and the joy she brought to everyone who knew her. These remembrances helped ensure that Lauren would be remembered for who she was rather than simply how she died. The case also contributed to ongoing discussions about the challenges facing domestic violence victims who are trying to leave abusive relationships. Lauren's story illustrated how the decision to leave can actually increase the danger that victims face, as abusers often escalate their violence when they sense that they are losing control over their victims. Educational programs developed in the wake of Lauren's death focused on helping people recognize the warning signs of abusive relationships and providing resources for those who might need help escaping dangerous situations. These programs emphasize that domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of their education, faith, socioeconomic status, or other factors that might seem protective. Lauren's legacy also included increased awareness about the manipulation tactics that abusers use to isolate their victims from support systems. Her story helped illustrate how abusers gradually undermine their victims' confidence, create conflict with family and friends, and systematically remove the resources that victims might use to escape dangerous situations. As we conclude Lauren's story, it's important to understand the profound impact her death had on everyone who knew her. and how her family has worked to ensure that her memory continues to make a difference in the world. Lauren's father, Dale Hugelmeyer, has spoken openly about the regret he carries, saying, "I think about it every day. What I did wrong. What I missed. Till this day, I just regret not knowing or keeping my eyes open and watching." These words reflect the burden that many family members of domestic violence victims carry. The weight of wondering if they could have done something to prevent the tragedy. The impact of Lauren's murder extended far beyond her immediate family. Her church community, where she had served as a beloved Sunday school teacher, was devastated by the loss of someone who had given so much of herself to helping others grow in their faith. The children she had taught remembered her kindness, her patience, and the way she made learning about faith both fun and meaningful. The Hugelmeyer family's decision to speak publicly about Lauren's case has helped bring attention to the often hidden nature of domestic violence. Dale Hugelmeyer believes Matthew Phelps planned the whole thing from the get-go, a perspective that highlights how calculated and deliberate many domestic violence cases truly are, despite perpetrators' attempts to minimize their responsibility. Lauren's story became part of a larger conversation about the warning signs of abusive relationships and the importance of taking action when someone expresses concern about their safety. Her case illustrated how abusers can maintain a public persona that completely contradicts their private behavior, making it difficult for even close family members to recognize the danger their loved one faces. The brutality of Lauren's death, stabbed 23 times according to the autopsy, served as a stark reminder of the lethal danger that domestic violence can pose. The excessive nature of the violence demonstrated the level of rage and control that characterized Matthew's actions, contradicting any claims that this was an accidental or unplanned event. In the years following the case, Lauren's story has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and television programs. Investigation Discovery's Cold-Blooded Medicine profiled the case, helping to keep her story in the public consciousness and continuing to educate people about domestic violence warning signs. The case also contributed to discussions within religious communities about the particular vulnerabilities that faith-based relationships can create. Matthew's status as an aspiring pastor had provided him with a level of trust and credibility that he systematically abused, highlighting the need for religious communities to be aware that predators can hide behind spiritual facades. Lauren's legacy lives on through the people whose lives she touched during her 29 years. Her students remember her dedication to helping them understand difficult concepts with patience and creativity. Her family carries forward her memory through their continued advocacy for domestic violence awareness and their commitment to ensuring that other families don't experience the tragedy they have endured. The Hugelmeyer family's courage in sharing their story publicly has helped other families recognize warning signs in their own loved ones' relationships. Their willingness to speak about their regrets and their grief has provided validation for other family members who have lost loved ones to domestic violence and who struggle with similar feelings of guilt and responsibility. As we remember Lauren Hugelmeyer, we remember a woman who embodied faith, kindness, and service to others. Her life was cut tragically short by someone who claimed to love her, but who ultimately saw her as something to be possessed rather than cherished. Her death serves as a reminder that domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of their faith, education, or social standing. Lauren's story also reminds us of the importance of believing people when they express concerns about their safety, of recognizing that leaving an abusive relationship can be the most dangerous time for victims, and of understanding that the facade of a perfect relationship can hide terrible secrets. In the quiet moments before sleep, as we reflect on Lauren's story, we can honor her memory by committing ourselves to being more aware of the people around us, more willing to offer help to those who might need it, and more determined to speak up when we see signs of abuse. Lauren's light was extinguished far too soon, but through the lessons her story teaches us, her impact continues to ripple outward, potentially saving other lives and preventing other tragedies. The magnolia trees still bloom white in Raleigh each spring, and in their beauty, we can remember Lauren Hugelmeyer, a woman whose life, though brief, was filled with love, service, and the kind of genuine kindness that makes the world a better place. Her memory calls us to be better protectors of one another, better recognizers of danger, and better advocates for those who cannot advocate for themselves. Matthew Phelps will spend the rest of his life in prison, but Lauren's influence continues through every person who learns from her story, every potential victim who recognizes warning signs because of her case, and every family member who finds the courage to intervene when they sense danger. In this way, Lauren's legacy transcends the tragedy of her death and continues to touch lives in ways she never could have imagined. Rest well, Lauren. Your story has been told, your life has been honored, and your memory will continue to make a difference in the world you loved so much. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to delve into a case that shocked the small community of Corning, New York. A story that began with what appeared to be a tragic suicide, but slowly unraveled into something much more sinister. This is the story of Michelle Neuroder, a 46-year-old mother of 3, whose life was cut short by those she trusted most. So let me tell you about a case that would expose the dark underbelly of a bitter custody battle and the dangerous lengths someone would go to avoid paying child support. Our story takes place in Corning, New York, a picturesque town nestled in the Finger Lakes region, known for its glass manufacturing heritage and quiet suburban streets. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where tragedy feels distant, and where no one could have imagined that a family dispute would lead to such devastating consequences. Michelle Neuroder was, by all accounts, a devoted mother. At 46 years old, she had spent the better part of 2 decades raising 3 daughters with her then-husband, Lloyd Neuroder. The family had once seemed typical of many American households: a working father, a caring mother, and children, who were the center of their world. But beneath this seemingly ordinary exterior, cracks had been forming for years. Michelle and Lloyd's marriage had deteriorated, leading to a divorce that would drag on for half a decade. What should have been a straightforward separation became a bitter, contentious battle that would consume both parents and, tragically, their children. Lloyd Neuroder was a man who, according to those who knew him, did not handle rejection or loss of control well. He was described by family members as someone who needed to be in charge, someone who didn't take kindly to being told what to do or how to live his life. The divorce proceedings had not gone in his favor, and he found himself facing financial obligations that he claimed he couldn't afford. The couple's 3 daughters, Carrie, who was 19 at the time of our story, and 2 younger sisters, one of whom was still a minor living with Michelle, found themselves caught in the middle of their parents' increasingly hostile relationship. Carrie, the eldest, had been living with her father in Rochester, New York, while the younger children remained with their mother in Corning. The custody battle over the youngest daughter had been particularly fierce. Lloyd had been fighting for years to gain custody, but the courts had consistently ruled in Michelle's favor. This meant that Lloyd was required to pay child support, a financial obligation that he claimed was destroying his life. By the summer of 2017, the tension between Michelle and Lloyd had reached a breaking point. Court documents would later reveal that Lloyd had been falling behind on his child support payments and was facing increasing pressure from the legal system to meet his financial obligations. He had spent years and thousands of dollars in legal fees trying to gain custody of his youngest daughter, all while being required to pay Michelle monthly support. For Michelle, the constant legal battles had taken their toll as well. She was a mother trying to provide stability for her children, while dealing with an ex-husband who seemed determined to make her life as difficult as possible. Friends and family members would later describe her as someone who was tired of the fighting, but determined to protect her children. The relationship between Michelle and her eldest daughter, Carrie, had become strained during this period. Carrie was living with her father, and those close to the family noticed that she seemed to be increasingly influenced by Lloyd's narrative about the custody battle. Lloyd had been telling Carrie that Michelle was keeping him from his daughter, that she was being unreasonable and greedy, and that she was the cause of all the family's problems. What no one realized at the time was that Lloyd's resentment toward Michelle was growing into something much more dangerous. He had begun to see Michelle not just as an obstacle to getting custody of his daughter, but as the root of all his problems. In his mind, if Michelle were no longer in the picture, his troubles would disappear. Lloyd's manipulation of Carrie during this period was subtle but persistent. He would tell her that he was depressed, that he couldn't afford to keep paying child support, and that he didn't know what he would do if things didn't change. He painted himself as the victim and Michelle as the villain, slowly but surely turning his daughter against her mother. The psychological manipulation was so gradual that Carrie later said she didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Her father had become her primary source of emotional support, and she had begun to see the world through his eyes. She believed that her mother was being unfair, that her father was suffering, and that something needed to be done to help him. In the weeks leading up to August 2017, Lloyd's desperation had reached a critical point. He was facing mounting legal pressure to pay his child support, and he had begun to realize that he was unlikely to win custody of his youngest daughter. It was during this period that he began to formulate a plan that would solve all his problems at once. Lloyd's plan was simple but sinister. If Michelle were dead, he would no longer have to pay child support, and he would likely gain custody of his youngest daughter. He began to share his thoughts with Carrie, at first in vague terms, but gradually becoming more specific about what he had in mind. The conversations between Lloyd and Carrie during this period would later be revealed through wiretaps and testimony. Lloyd would tell his daughter that he was thinking about ending it all, that he couldn't see any other way out of his situation. He would talk about how much better things would be if Michelle were no longer around, and he would suggest that maybe someone should do something about the situation. Carrie, who was young and had been psychologically manipulated by her father for months, found herself in an impossible position. She loved her father and believed that he was suffering unfairly. She had been told repeatedly that her mother was the cause of all their problems, and she had begun to believe that her father might actually hurt himself if something didn't change. It was during this vulnerable state that Lloyd presented Carrie with what he called a choice. He told her that he was going to kill himself if she didn't help him with his plan to kill Michelle. He made it clear that in his mind there were only two options: help him murder her mother or watch him commit suicide. For a 19-year-old who had been manipulated and emotionally abused, this felt like an impossible decision. Carrie would later describe feeling like she had to choose between her parents, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing her father to suicide. She agreed to help him with his plan. August 26, 2017, started like any other day in Corning, New York. Michelle Neurotter was at home with her youngest daughter, going about her usual weekend routine. She had no idea that her ex-husband and eldest daughter were about to arrive with deadly intentions. Lloyd had been staying at a hotel in Rochester, about an hour's drive from Corning. He had told Carrie to pick him up and drive him to Michelle's house, where they would carry out their plan. The plan was for Carrie to keep her younger sister occupied while Lloyd went upstairs to confront Michelle. When they arrived at Michelle's house on Dwight Avenue, everything appeared normal from the outside. It was a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place where people felt safe and secure. Michelle's house was a modest two-story home, where she had been trying to build a stable life for her children, despite the ongoing custody battle. Carrie entered the house first, greeting her mother and younger sister as if this were a normal family visit. She made small talk and found ways to keep her sister distracted, all while knowing what her father was planning to do upstairs. The psychological burden of this deception would haunt her for years to come. Lloyd entered the house shortly after Carrie and made his way upstairs to Michelle's bedroom. What happened next would be reconstructed through physical evidence and Lloyd's eventual confession. He confronted Michelle in her bedroom, and when she likely tried to resist or call for help, he strangled her with his bare hands. The murder was brutal and personal. Lloyd had to look his ex-wife in the eyes as he took her life, knowing that his own daughter was downstairs, complicit in the crime. Michelle fought for her life, but she was no match for Lloyd's size and strength. Within minutes, it was over. After Michelle was dead, Lloyd called for Carrie to come upstairs. Together, they began to stage the scene to make it look like a suicide. They positioned Michelle's body and placed a rope around her neck, trying to make it appear that she had hanged herself. They moved furniture and tried to create a scenario that would fool investigators. The staging of Michelle's death was crucial to Lloyd's plan. He knew that if the death appeared to be a suicide, there would be less investigation, and he would be free to gain custody of his youngest daughter and avoid paying child support. He had thought through many of the details, but he had underestimated the skill of the investigators who would eventually work the case. Lloyd and Carrie worked together to create what they hoped would be a convincing suicide scene. They positioned Michelle's body at the bottom of the stairs, with a rope around her neck, trying to make it appear that she had hanged herself from the banister above. They arranged the scene to suggest that Michelle had been depressed and had taken her own life. The psychological impact on Carrie during this process cannot be overstated. She was helping to stage her own mother's death, participating in a cover-up that would change her life forever. She would later describe feeling like she was in a nightmare, going through the motions while her mind struggled to process what was happening. After they had finished staging the scene, Lloyd and Carrie left the house. Their plan was to create alibis and wait for someone else to discover Michelle's body. They drove back toward Rochester, believing that they had committed the perfect crime. Lloyd's plan seemed to be working. He had eliminated the person he saw as the source of all his problems, and he believed that he had done so in a way that would never be traced back to him. He had involved his daughter in the crime, ensuring her silence through complicity, and he had created what he thought was a convincing suicide scene. On August 28, 2017, 2 days after Michelle's murder, a neighbor called 911 to report suspicious circumstances at Michelle's house. The neighbor had seen Michelle standing motionless at the bottom of her stairs and was concerned about her welfare. When police arrived at the scene, they found Michelle's body exactly as Lloyd and Carrie had staged it. At first glance, the scene did appear to be a suicide. Michelle was found with a rope around her neck, and there were no obvious signs of struggle or forced entry. The house was quiet, and Michelle's youngest daughter was nowhere to be found, having been staying with relatives that weekend. However, Corning Police Chief Jeff Spaulding had extensive experience with death investigations, and something about the scene didn't sit right with him. There were small details that seemed inconsistent with a typical suicide: the position of the body, the way the rope was tied, and what he would later describe as an unsettling rope mark on Michelle's chin. The initial investigation proceeded cautiously. While the scene appeared to be a suicide, Chief Spaulding ordered a thorough examination of the house and Michelle's body. The medical examiner was called in to perform an autopsy, and investigators began the process of notifying Michelle's family and gathering information about her state of mind leading up to her death. When investigators tried to contact Lloyd to inform him of his ex-wife's death, they discovered that he was unreachable. His phone was turned off, and he was not at his usual residence. This raised additional red flags for the investigating team, as it was unusual for a father not to be immediately available when his children's mother had died. Carrie, on the other hand, was found in her apartment in Rochester. When she was informed of her mother's death, her reaction seemed appropriate to the circumstances. She appeared shocked and grief-stricken, which was exactly what Lloyd had coached her to display. As the investigation into Michelle's death progressed, inconsistencies in the suicide theory began to emerge. The autopsy revealed that Michelle had died from asphyxiation, but the manner of her death was not consistent with hanging. The rope marks on her neck and the position of her body suggested that she had been strangled before being staged to look like a suicide. Chief Spaulding and his team began to look more closely at Michelle's personal life and relationships. They discovered the bitter custody battle between Michelle and Lloyd, and they learned about the financial pressures that Lloyd had been facing. The more they learned about the family dynamics, the more suspicious they became about the circumstances of Michelle's death. The investigation team decided to conduct a more thorough examination of the crime scene. They brought in specialists to analyze the rope, the position of the body, and the physical evidence in the house. What they found confirmed their suspicions. This was not a suicide, but a carefully staged murder. Evidence at the scene suggested that there had been a struggle in Michelle's bedroom. Despite the staging downstairs, there were signs that furniture had been moved, and the forensic evidence indicated that Michelle had been killed upstairs and then moved to the bottom of the stairs. The rope around her neck had been placed there after she was already dead. As investigators dug deeper into Lloyd's background, they discovered that he had been under increasing financial and legal pressure in the months leading up to Michelle's death. He had been falling behind on child support payments, and court documents showed that he had been fighting unsuccessfully for years to gain custody of his youngest daughter. The investigation team also learned about Lloyd's relationship with Carrie and began to suspect that she might have been involved in the crime. However, they needed more evidence before they could make any arrests. They decided to use surveillance and wiretaps to gather additional information about the family's activities and communications. In November 2017, about 2 months after Michelle's death, Corning police obtained authorization to wiretap Lloyd and Carrie's phone conversations. This decision would prove to be crucial to solving the case, as it would reveal the truth about what had happened on August 20. The wiretaps captured conversations between Lloyd and Carrie that were nothing short of shocking. Rather than the grieving father and daughter that they appeared to be in public, the recordings revealed two people who were coordinating their stories and discussing how to avoid detection by police. In one particularly damning conversation, Lloyd could be heard coaching Carrie on how to respond to police questions. He reminded her to appear emotional and grief-stricken, and he provided her with specific answers to give if investigators asked about their whereabouts on the day of the murder. The recordings also revealed Lloyd's lack of remorse about Michelle's death. Rather than expressing grief or regret, he seemed primarily concerned with avoiding prosecution and gaining custody of his youngest daughter. He talked about how much better things would be now that Michelle was gone, and he expressed satisfaction that his financial problems were solved. For Carrie, the recordings painted a picture of a young woman who was struggling with guilt and fear. She could be heard asking her father whether they would be caught, and she expressed anxiety about the ongoing investigation. It was clear that she was deeply troubled by what they had done, but she was also terrified of her father and what he might do if she didn't continue to cooperate with his story. The wiretaps provided investigators with the evidence they needed to make arrests. The conversations between Lloyd and Carrie were clear proof that they had conspired to kill Michelle and had worked together to stage the scene as a suicide. After months of careful investigation, the police were finally ready to act. On January 24, 2018, nearly 5 months after Michelle's murder, Lloyd and Carrie Neureuther were arrested and charged with her death. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community of Corning, where residents had initially believed that Michelle had committed suicide. Lloyd was charged with first-degree murder, while Carrie was charged as an accomplice. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The wiretaps, the forensic evidence from the crime scene, and the inconsistencies in their stories all pointed to their guilt. When Lloyd was arrested, he initially maintained his innocence and continued to claim that Michelle had committed suicide. However, as the evidence mounted against him, it became clear that his position was untenable. The prosecution had a strong case, and Lloyd's attorneys advised him to consider a plea deal. Carrie's situation was more complex. While she had clearly participated in the crime, her attorneys argued that she had been manipulated and coerced by her father. They painted a picture of a young woman who had been psychologically abused, and who had believed that she was choosing between her parents' lives. The case attracted significant media attention, both locally and nationally. The story of a father who had manipulated his daughter into helping him kill her mother was shocking and tragic. It raised questions about the effects of parental alienation and the lengths to which some people will go to avoid their responsibilities. As the legal proceedings got underway, more details about the crime began to emerge. Lloyd's manipulation of Carrie was revealed to be far more extensive than initially realized. He had been systematically turning her against her mother for years, using emotional manipulation and threats to control her behavior. In October 2018, Lloyd Neureuther pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. During his plea hearing, he admitted to planning Michelle's death and acknowledged that he had manipulated Carrie into helping him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lloyd's confession finally provided the complete picture of what had happened on August 26, 2017. He admitted that he had been motivated by his desire to avoid paying child support, and his belief that he would gain custody of his youngest daughter if Michelle were dead. He acknowledged that he had strangled Michelle with his bare hands, and that he had forced Carrie to help him stage the scene. Carrie Neureuther pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison. Her sentence was relatively light, reflecting the court's recognition that she had been manipulated and coerced by her father. She was released on parole in February 2020 after serving approximately 2 years. The case had devastating consequences for the entire family. Michelle was dead, Lloyd was spending the rest of his life in prison, and Carrie had to live with the knowledge that she had participated in her mother's murder. The youngest daughter, who had been the subject of the custody battle, was left orphaned and traumatized by the actions of her father and sister. The murder of Michelle Neureuther serves as a tragic reminder of how family disputes can escalate into violence and how psychological manipulation can lead to devastating consequences. It's a story of greed, control, and the terrible price that can be paid when someone refuses to accept responsibility for their actions. Chief Jeff Spaulding, who led the investigation, would later say that this was one of the most disturbing cases he had ever worked. The idea that a father would manipulate his own daughter into helping him commit murder was something that even experienced investigators found difficult to comprehend. Today, Michelle Neureuther is remembered by those who knew her as a loving mother who died trying to protect her children. Her death was a tragedy that could have been prevented if Lloyd had been willing to accept the court's decisions and meet his responsibilities as a father. The case also highlighted the importance of recognizing the signs of parental alienation and psychological manipulation. Carrie's experience shows how even adult children can be influenced and controlled by manipulative parents, and how important it is to seek help when family relationships become toxic. As we close this story, we're reminded that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives have been forever changed by violence and tragedy. Michelle Neuroder's death was not just a crime to be solved, but the loss of a mother, daughter, and friend whose life had value and meaning beyond the circumstances of her death. This has been the story of Michelle Neuroder, a case that shocked a small New York community and revealed the dark side of a bitter family dispute. Thank you for listening, and rest well knowing that justice was ultimately served, even though it came too late for Michelle herself.